Origins of the Ottomans. The origins of the Ottomans trace back to a turbulent period of political fragmentation, tribal migrations, and shifting empires in the late 13th century. This was a time when the once powerful Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was crumbling under pressure from Mongol invasions and internal strife, leaving behind a mosaic of semi-independent Turkish principalities known as beyliks. It was in this fractured landscape on the frontier between the Islamic world and the weakening Byzantine Empire in northwestern Anatolia that a small and relatively obscure tribe would rise to establish one of the most enduring empires in history, the Ottoman Empire. The emergence of the Ottomans was not the result of a single event or figure, but rather a gradual evolution shaped by a convergence of cultural, military, religious, and geographical factors. At the center of this transformation was a man named Osman, from whom the empire would eventually take its name. Osman I, or Osman Gazi, was the son of Ertuğrul, the leader of the Kaya tribe, a branch of the larger Oghuz Turkic peoples who had migrated to Anatolia from Central Asia. The Kaya, like many other Turkic tribes, were fleeing the Mongol onslaught in the east and seeking new lands to settle. They were nomadic, warlike, and deeply embedded in the ethos of Gaza, the holy war against non-Muslims, which gave their military campaigns both a spiritual and political justification. Ertuğrul had served under the Seljuks and had been granted land near Söğüt and Domanik as a frontier warrior, tasked with defending the borders against Byzantine incursions. Following Ertuğrul's death around 1280, Osman inherited leadership of the tribe. He quickly proved himself not just as a capable warrior, but as a charismatic and strategic leader. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were content with raiding and defending their territories, Osman had a vision of expansion and consolidation. He began pushing deeper into Byzantine territory, seizing towns, fortresses, and eventually establishing a permanent base of power. What distinguished Osman's leadership was his ability to forge alliances, incorporate local populations, and portray himself not merely as a tribal chieftain, but as a legitimate ruler with divine favor. Through calculated marriages, clever diplomacy, and appeals to Islamic legitimacy, Osman was able to elevate his status and broaden his support base. The region in which Osman and his successors operated was uniquely suited to their ambitions. The borderlands between Byzantium and the Muslim beyliks offered both opportunity and danger. It was a liminal space where cultures, religions, and political systems collided. The Byzantine Empire, once a dominant power, had by this point become a shadow of its former self, plagued by internal conflicts, dynastic disputes, and economic decline. This allowed Turkish forces to advance relatively unopposed, taking advantage of weakened garrisons and disaffected local populations. Furthermore, the region was rich in trade routes, fertile lands, and strategic forts, resources that could sustain a growing power if managed wisely. As Osman's realm grew, so did his authority. He began minting coins in his name, a powerful symbol of sovereignty, and reportedly received the title of Sultan from neighboring Muslim leaders. His warriors, known as Ghazis, were drawn from a wide array of backgrounds: Turks, converted Christians, dervishes, and mercenaries. This diverse coalition was united not by ethnicity, but by a shared commitment to conquest and the promise of plunder and land. This flexibility and inclusivity became hallmarks of Ottoman governance, allowing them to absorb and adapt rather than merely dominate. After Osman's death around 1326, his son Orhan carried forward the legacy. Orhan expanded Ottoman control into more Byzantine territory, including the important city of Bursa, which would become the first true Ottoman capital. The fall of Bursa marked a significant shift. The Ottomans were no longer just a frontier band of warriors, but a centralized political entity with administrative institutions, taxation systems, and bureaucratic oversight. This process of state building was crucial as it laid the groundwork for the transformation from a tribal confederation to a full-fledged empire. The Ottomans began developing a more formalized military, a corps of administrators, and a system of succession that, while at times chaotic, maintained a continuity of leadership. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ottomans' rise was their pragmatic approach to power. They did not impose rigid cultural or religious structures on their newly conquered territories. Instead, they allowed a degree of autonomy, especially to Christians and Jews, under the millet system, a policy that would later be formalized but was rooted in early Ottoman practice. By tolerating and even embracing diversity in their realm, the Ottomans secured loyalty from varied populations, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and encouraging economic stability. Religion played a dual role in Ottoman expansion. On one hand, Islamic principles and the concept of Gaza inspired the warriors and lent spiritual legitimacy to their campaigns. On the other hand, the Ottomans were keenly aware of the political utility of religion. They aligned themselves with powerful religious figures and orders, including Sufi brotherhoods, who often served as intermediaries between the state and the people. These Sufi networks helped to spread Ottoman influence far beyond their military reach, especially in rural and newly conquered regions. Another key factor in the Ottomans' early success was their ability to integrate advanced military technologies and strategies from both East and West. While their initial conquests relied heavily on cavalry and guerrilla tactics, they were quick to adopt siege warfare, gunpowder weapons, and professionalized infantry units. This adaptability allowed them to take on more formidable foes, including well-defended Byzantine cities and rival Muslim states. By the time of Murad I, who succeeded Orhan, the Ottomans were well on their way to becoming a dominant force in both Anatolia and the Balkans. The early Ottomans also benefited from the decline of other major powers in the region. The Mongols, who had previously dominated Persia and Central Asia, were retreating and fragmenting. The Byzantine Empire was collapsing, and the Crusader states in the Levant had largely disappeared. This power vacuum allowed the Ottomans to step in as both conquerors and unifiers. They began to present themselves as the legitimate heirs of Islamic leadership, eventually adopting the caliphal title and assuming responsibility for protecting the Muslim world, a role that added a spiritual dimension to their expanding temporal power. Perhaps most importantly, the Ottomans cultivated a unique identity that transcended tribal affiliation. They were Turks by origin, Muslims by faith, but their empire would become a cosmopolitan amalgam of influences: Persian, Arab, Byzantine, and Balkan. This synthesis was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate policy, intermarriage, patronage of diverse art forms, and an administrative structure that rewarded merit over birthright. This broad-based identity allowed the Ottomans to rule over an incredibly diverse population for centuries, maintaining relative stability even as other empires fractured. In hindsight, the rise of the Ottomans might seem almost inevitable given their success, but at the time, it was far from guaranteed. They were one of many small principalities in a volatile and contested landscape. What set them apart was not just their military prowess, but their vision, adaptability, and political wisdom. Osman's dream, as recorded in Ottoman legends, was of a tree growing from his chest whose branches would shade the world. While the imagery is poetic, it captures the essence of the Ottoman rise, rooted in the soil of Anatolia, but destined to spread far beyond, shaping the course of history across 3 continents. Orhan Gazi and early expansion. Orhan Gazi, the son of Osman I and the second ruler of the nascent Ottoman polity, inherited not just his father's vision, but also the weight of shaping a fragile beylik into a formidable and expanding state. When Osman passed away around 1323 or 1324, the Ottoman domain was still relatively modest in size, nestled in the rugged frontier zones of northwestern Anatolia. But under Orhan's leadership, this small principality began to evolve into something far more consequential. The early expansion of the Ottoman Empire owes much to Orhan's strategic foresight, military innovations, and political acumen, all of which laid the foundation for centuries of imperial dominance. At the time of his accession, Orhan was faced with the typical dilemmas of a frontier ruler: maintain tribal unity, protect existing territories, and expand further into the collapsing Byzantine realm. Yet Orhan was not merely a warrior prince. He was an astute statesman who understood that for the Ottoman state to endure, it needed more than conquest. It required consolidation, institutional development, and legitimacy. He swiftly established himself not only as a military commander, but also as a political leader, capable of fostering a centralized authority over his followers and the diverse populations under his rule. One of Orhan's first major military successes was the capture of Bursa in 1326. This event marked a turning point not only in Orhan's rule, but in Ottoman history as a whole. Bursa had long been a significant Byzantine stronghold in northwestern Anatolia, and its fall symbolized the irreversible decline of Byzantine power in the region. But Orhan did not simply sack the city, he made it his capital. This decision reflected a deeper vision that the Ottomans would not just raid and plunder, as many neighboring beyliks did, but would settle, govern, and absorb. Bursa became a center of administration, trade, and Islamic scholarship. It was here that many of the early Ottoman architectural and educational foundations were laid. The city's transformation under Orhan's rule revealed a pattern that would become quintessentially Ottoman: military conquest followed by civic and cultural development. Orhan also married strategically. His union with Theodora, the daughter of Byzantine Emperor John VI, Kantakouzenos, was a political masterstroke that helped legitimize Ottoman authority in the eyes of both Muslims and Christians. This marriage also allowed the Ottomans to position themselves as intermediaries rather than outright enemies of the Byzantine state, at least for a time. The blending of military expansion with diplomatic alliances demonstrated Orhan's nuanced approach to statecraft. Rather than simply relying on force, he recognized the power of political symbolism and the importance of navigating the complex web of Anatolian and Balkan politics. As the Ottomans under Orhan expanded, they began to confront not only Byzantine remnants but also rival Turkish beyliks and the forces of Christendom to the west. One of the most important innovations attributed to Orhan's rule was the establishment of a standing army, the beginnings of what would later become the Janissary Corps. Traditionally, frontier warriors, Gazis, would rally for specific campaigns and then return home. Orhan recognized the limitations of this model and sought a more reliable and professional military force. This decision would have far-reaching consequences, allowing the Ottomans to conduct more sustained and organized military operations. The Janissaries, who would later play pivotal roles in both expansion and administration, had their institutional seeds in Orhan's reign. With the foundation of a stronger army and a more centralized administration, Orhan looked toward Europe. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal strife and external pressure, was vulnerable. In a particularly ironic twist of fate, it was the Byzantines themselves who, in seeking aid during a civil war, invited the Ottomans across the Dardanelles into Thrace. In 1352, Orhan's forces occupied the fortress of Chimpe, granted by John VI Kantakouzenos as a reward for military support. This moment was monumental. It marked the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe. What followed was the occupation of Gallipoli in 1354 after a devastating earthquake had destroyed the city's walls. Though the Byzantines protested, the Ottomans refused to withdraw. The opportunity had been too great, and Orhan seized it. This marked the beginning of Ottoman European expansion and the start of a centuries-long presence in the Balkans. With Gallipoli secured, the Ottomans began sending more settlers and troops across the straits, and the demographic landscape of the region started to change. Turkish and Muslim communities took root, and a new era of intercontinental conquest had begun. Orhan's vision of statehood extended far beyond military conquest. He took significant steps toward creating institutions that would give the Ottoman state endurance. He developed rudimentary administrative divisions, appointed trusted governors, and promoted Islamic education. Mosques, madrasas, and public works projects were funded in newly conquered areas. This approach helped integrate conquered populations into the Ottoman system and provided the ideological legitimacy of an Islamic polity. The Ottomans, under Orhan's leadership, were not merely conquerors but civilizers in their own context, providing order and a framework of justice where previously there had been chaos or neglect. Yet Orhan was not immune to internal challenges. Managing a growing and ethnically diverse state required balancing competing interests. The frontier warriors who had once fought for loot now had to adhere to laws and bureaucratic systems. Tribal leaders who had once enjoyed semi-autonomy began to chafe under centralizing policies. Orhan, through a combination of diplomacy, religious patronage, and military might, managed to maintain cohesion. His use of Islamic scholars and judges, ulama and qadis, to lend moral and legal authority to his rule was particularly effective. The Ottomans began to be seen not just as military conquerors, but as upholders of a moral and religious order. By the time of Orhan's death in the 1360s, the Ottomans were no longer a minor frontier beylik. They were a burgeoning empire. He had more than doubled the territories inherited from his father, extended Ottoman rule into Europe, and laid down the institutional infrastructure necessary for long-term statehood. His reign set precedents in governance, military organization, and diplomacy that would shape Ottoman policy for generations. While Osman I founded the dream, Orhan built the reality. What made Orhan's expansion so durable was its integration of different aspects of rule, military, political, social, and religious, into a cohesive framework. He did not rely on force alone, nor did he neglect the spiritual and cultural elements that would bind his subjects together. Orhan's state was both a sword and a pen, capable of defeating enemies on the battlefield and also of administering justice, building cities, and cultivating a sense of belonging among diverse populations. In many ways, Orhan Gazi is one of the most underappreciated figures in Ottoman history. He ruled during a time of flux, when the boundaries of the known world were being redrawn, and he navigated that world with remarkable skill. He understood the importance of both continuity and change, respecting tribal traditions while innovating new institutions, honoring religious principles while engaging with Christian powers, and waging war while laying the foundations for peace and prosperity. The legacy of Orhan Gazi endures not just in the cities he conquered or the institutions he founded, but in the model of leadership he embodied. His reign was one of transition, from a tribal confederation to an emerging empire. In his life's work, we see the early silhouette of the Ottoman Empire that would one day stretch across 3 continents. Through deliberate strategy, deep pragmatism, and a vision that extended far beyond his own time, Orhan Gazi helped write the first chapter of a story that would echo through centuries. Murad I and the Balkan Push. Murad was the 3rd ruler of the nascent Ottoman Empire, was a man of vision, ambition, and relentless military drive. His reign, spanning from 1362 to 1389, marked one of the most significant turning points in Ottoman history, when the empire truly began to transform from a regional Anatolian power into a dominant force in southeastern Europe. At the heart of this transformation was Murad's campaign into the Balkans, a push that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of the region for centuries to come. His leadership was defined not only by conquest, but by his ability to consolidate power, forge alliances, and lay the groundwork for a centralized state. The story of Murad I and the Balkan Push is not merely one of war and territorial expansion. It is a tale of vision, endurance, and the forging of a legacy that would echo through the centuries. Murad's ascent to power followed the death of his father, Orhan Gazi. By this time, the Ottomans had already laid down roots in parts of northwestern Anatolia and had taken their first steps into Europe by crossing the Dardanelles. But it was under Murad that these early forays would evolve into a full-scale Balkan campaign. He inherited not only a fledgling empire, but also a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and enemies both within Anatolia and across the Balkan Peninsula. To secure his realm, Murad knew that he had to stabilize the home front while expanding the empire's borders, and he wasted no time in doing so. Murad moved the capital from Bursa to the city of Edirne, formerly Adrianople, located on the European side of the Dardanelles. This decision was not merely symbolic. It reflected the growing strategic importance of the Balkans in the Ottoman vision of empire. Edirne was well positioned as a military and administrative hub, providing easier access to European territories and facilitating more direct control over conquered regions. This shift underscored Murad's seriousness about Ottoman ambitions in Europe. With Edirne as his base, he launched a series of campaigns that would bring much of the Balkans under Ottoman control, either through direct conquest or vassalage. Murad's military campaigns were swift and strategic. He capitalized on the internal divisions and rivalries that plagued the fragmented Balkan states. At the time, the Balkans were a mosaic of principalities, kingdoms, and duchies, many of which were weakened by internal strife and vulnerable to external threats. Murad was quick to exploit these weaknesses. His armies swept through Thrace and into Macedonia and Bulgaria, capturing key fortresses and cities that bolstered Ottoman control over trade routes and military positions. Not all of this expansion was achieved through brute force. Murad was also a skilled diplomat who frequently used political marriages, treaties, and promises of autonomy to bring local rulers into the Ottoman fold as vassals. Among Murad's greatest strengths was his ability to institutionalize the empire's military structure. He formalized the corps of Janissaries, elite infantry units drawn largely from Christian youths who were converted to Islam and trained to become professional soldiers. This corps would become one of the most formidable military forces in the world and a central pillar of Ottoman military success for centuries. Murad also developed the Timar system, in which land grants were given to cavalry soldiers, sipahis, in exchange for military service. This created a loyal and motivated class of military landholders, reinforcing Ottoman presence in newly conquered territories. Murad's expansion into the Balkans was not without resistance. The most serious challenge came from a coalition of Balkan states alarmed by the rapid Ottoman advance. In 1371, this coalition, led by the Serbian noble Vukašin Mrnjavčević and his brother Jovan Uglješa, gathered a sizable force to halt the Ottomans. Murad responded with decisive force. The two armies met at the Battle of Maritsa near the Maritsa River. In a brilliantly executed night attack, Murad's forces utterly routed the coalition. The battle was a catastrophe for the Balkan allies. Many of their leaders were killed, and the road deeper into the Balkans was now wide open to Ottoman conquest. The psychological blow was enormous, signaling to other Balkan rulers the formidable power of the Ottoman military machine. In the aftermath of Maritsa, Murad continued his relentless march. He consolidated control over large parts of southern and central Serbia, while also exerting influence over Wallachia and other surrounding territories. Many rulers chose to submit to Ottoman authority and pay tribute rather than face destruction. Some even entered into military alliances with Murad, fighting alongside his forces in future campaigns. This mixture of coercion, diplomacy, and opportunism proved extraordinarily effective. Murad was not content with mere conquest. He aimed to integrate the Balkans into the Ottoman political and administrative structure, ensuring long-term control. Yet the defining moment of Murad's Balkan campaign, and indeed his reign, came in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo. This confrontation was the culmination of years of tension and resistance from the Serbian principalities, particularly under the leadership of Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović. Both sides understood the stakes. For the Ottomans, victory would cement their dominance in the Balkans. For the Serbs, it was a last desperate bid to halt the advancing tide. The armies clashed on the field of Kosovo Polje in one of the most legendary battles in Balkan history. The Battle of Kosovo was fierce, bloody, and inconclusive in military terms, with heavy losses on both sides. However, it resulted in a strategic Ottoman victory, as the Serbian resistance was effectively broken. Prince Lazar was captured and executed, while Murad I himself was assassinated during or shortly after the battle by a Serbian noble who infiltrated the camp under the guise of a defector. Despite his death, the outcome of the battle secured the Balkans for the Ottomans and confirmed the empire's place as a dominant force in southeastern Europe. Murad's death at Kosovo would become the stuff of legend. His son Bayezid I immediately took control of the army and suppressed any signs of internal unrest, ensuring the continuity of leadership and the stability of the empire. Bayezid's swift and effective succession was a testament to the institutional foundations that Murad had laid during his reign. The Ottoman Empire, once a small frontier principality, was now a burgeoning imperial power with a firm foothold in Europe, and Murad's leadership had been central to this transformation. The legacy of Murad I is deeply woven into the fabric of Ottoman and Balkan history. His reign marked the decisive shift of Ottoman focus from Anatolia to Europe, a pivot that would define the empire's geopolitical trajectory for centuries. He expanded the territory dramatically, reformed and professionalized the military, and created administrative systems that would endure well beyond his time. His ability to blend military might with political pragmatism allowed the Ottomans to outmaneuver and absorb a region that was notoriously difficult to conquer and even harder to hold. But Murad's Balkan push was more than a military campaign. It was a cultural and civilizational transformation. As Ottoman forces moved into new lands, they brought with them not only soldiers but also administrators, architects, scholars, and merchants. Mosques rose beside churches, bazaars flourished, and Islamic institutions began to take root in the Balkan soil. This fusion of cultures created a unique socio-political tapestry that would define the region for generations. While the conquest was often violent and disruptive, it also brought with it new forms of governance, trade, and social organization that integrated the Balkans into the broader world of the Ottoman Empire. In the grand arc of Ottoman history, Murad I stands as a foundational figure. His strategic vision, military prowess, and state-building innovations enabled the transformation of the Ottomans from a border emirate into an empire straddling two continents. The Balkan push under his leadership was not only a territorial expansion, it was the forging of an empire's soul, an enterprise that would shape the destiny of millions and leave an indelible mark on the history of both East and West. Bayezid I and the Ottoman apex Bayezid I, also known by the epithet Yildirim, or the Thunderbolt, stood as one of the most ambitious and formidable rulers of the early Ottoman Empire. His reign, which lasted from 1389 until his capture in 1402, marked a dramatic apex in Ottoman expansion and authority, showcasing both the immense potential and vulnerability of the empire. Born around 1360, Bayezid was the son of Murad, a sultan who had laid down the foundations of Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. The young prince was groomed in the art of governance and war, and by the time his father was killed at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, Bayezid was more than prepared to assume the throne. With unflinching speed, he consolidated power and immediately took control, solidifying his reputation with a decisive and bold temperament that would define his rule. The name Thunderbolt was not just a poetic flourish. It reflected his strategic swiftness and unrelenting military campaigns that struck like lightning across the territories he sought to dominate. Bayezid's rule commenced in an era of constant warfare and shifting alliances. The Balkans were a fragmented mosaic of Christian and Muslim states, where diplomacy was often as sharp as the sword. Bayezid, inheriting both the ambition and military apparatus of his father, swiftly resumed the Ottoman campaign of expansion. Serbia was brought under tighter control, and Bosnia, along with parts of Albania and Bulgaria, fell under Ottoman sway. These were not merely symbolic conquests. They brought new revenue, manpower, and political leverage to the Ottomans. Bayezid's military strength was formidable, comprising not just the traditional cavalry and infantry, but also an increasingly sophisticated administrative system that enabled rapid mobilization and logistical support. His leadership style blended brutality with pragmatism. Cities that resisted were razed, while those that surrendered were often allowed to maintain local autonomy under Ottoman suzerainty. This dual approach allowed Bayezid to exert control over vast and diverse populations without overextending his resources. The ambition of Bayezid knew few bounds. His next major endeavor was to bring the Anatolian beyliks under a unified Ottoman banner. After the disintegration of the Seljuk Sultanate, Anatolia had become a patchwork of competing Turkish principalities. While his predecessors had occasionally clashed with these beyliks, Bayezid aimed for total dominance. Through a mix of warfare and diplomacy, he absorbed these states into the Ottoman fold, notably defeating the Karamanids, a powerful rival in central Anatolia. This unification of Anatolia was not merely a territorial ambition, it was ideological. Bayezid sought to be the undisputed heir of the Seljuks, the torchbearer of a revived Islamic unity in the region. He claimed the title of Sultan of Rum, echoing the historic authority of earlier Muslim empires that had ruled Anatolia. This vision extended even further. Bayezid envisioned himself not just as a regional conqueror, but as the preeminent Islamic leader, capable of standing against both Eastern rivals and Western Christendom. Bayezid's increasing power and territorial ambitions did not go unnoticed by the rest of Europe. The Christian kingdoms, particularly Hungary, were alarmed by the Ottoman advances into the Balkans. This anxiety culminated in the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, one of the largest crusader expeditions of the late medieval period. A coalition of European forces, led by King Sigismund of Hungary, and comprising knights from France, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire, launched an offensive against the Ottomans. The campaign, marked by overconfidence and poor coordination among the Crusaders, met a disastrous end at the hands of Bayezid's forces. At Nicopolis, Bayezid not only demonstrated his military genius, but also his ruthlessness. Thousands of crusaders were either slain or taken prisoner, and the victory solidified his reputation across Europe as a powerful and fearsome sultan. The defeat at Nicopolis was a sobering moment for Christendom, and temporarily halted any serious Western challenge to Ottoman dominance in the region. Flush with victory, Bayezid turned his attention back to internal consolidation. He established strong administrative frameworks to govern his expanding empire, relying on a network of viziers, tax officials, and regional governors. He continued the policy of devshirm, the recruitment of Christian boys who were converted to Islam and trained as soldiers or administrators. This practice fed the Janissary Corps, which had become the backbone of the Ottoman military. Bayezid was not only a warrior, but also a patron of culture and architecture. He commissioned mosques, schools, and bridges, many of which bore his name and testified to his grand vision of an Ottoman golden age. His court became a center of art and learning, attracting scholars and poets from across the Islamic world. In cities like Bursa, which served as the capital during his reign, monumental architecture and vibrant marketplaces reflected the growing wealth and confidence of the Ottoman state. Yet as Bayezid reached the height of his power, new clouds were gathering on the horizon. The East, which had long been fractured, was beginning to produce a new and terrifying force. Timur, also known as Tamerlane. A brilliant military leader with his own dreams of empire, Timur was carving out a realm across Central Asia and Persia. The two titans were on a collision course. Their rivalry was not just territorial, it was ideological and personal. Timur viewed Bayezid's rise with suspicion and contempt, while Bayezid saw Timur as a dangerous usurper who threatened the very order he had worked to establish. The tension between them escalated as both men vied for influence over the fractured beyliks of Anatolia. Timur demanded that Bayezid cease his expansion and recognize his supremacy. Bayezid refused. This defiance set the stage for one of the most consequential confrontations in Islamic history, the Battle of Ankara in 1402. The battle that followed was catastrophic for Bayezid. Despite commanding a large and experienced army, Bayezid's forces were outmaneuvered by Timur's tactically superior troops. The desert heat, the defection of some Anatolian princes to Timur's side, and the exhaustion of Bayezid's troops contributed to a devastating defeat. Bayezid himself was captured, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic and Christian worlds. The image of the mighty thunderbolt, once triumphant over crusaders and rival beyliks alike, now languishing in captivity, symbolized the fragility of even the greatest empires. According to later accounts, some embellished by legend, Bayezid was humiliated in captivity, forced to endure mockery by Timur's court. Though these tales are debated, what is certain is that Bayezid died in captivity a year later, in 1403, marking a tragic end to a reign that had soared to dizzying heights. Bayezid's death did not just signify the fall of a man, it marked a turning point in Ottoman history. The immediate aftermath of his defeat plunged the empire into a period of civil war and fragmentation known as the Ottoman Interregnum, or the Fetret Devri. His sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, each claimed the throne, dividing the empire among themselves and waging war against one another. This fratricidal struggle, lasting over a decade, severely weakened the empire's administrative coherence and military strength. The momentum of expansion that Bayezid had generated so forcefully came to a screeching halt. European powers, sensing Ottoman vulnerability, began to fortify their borders and reconsider alliances. Meanwhile, the Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had subdued reasserted their independence, unraveling the carefully constructed unity he had imposed on the region. For a time, it seemed as if Bayezid's dream of an Ottoman-led Islamic empire might dissolve entirely into chaos and obscurity. And yet, despite this fragmentation, the legacy of Bayezid I endured in ways that would later prove critical to the survival and eventual resurgence of the Ottoman Empire. His centralization of authority, cultivation of a professional military corps, and administrative innovations laid a structural foundation that his successors would later rebuild upon. Even in ruin, Bayezid's institutions showed a remarkable resilience. His investment in the Janissaries, though temporarily scattered, ensured that future sultans would have access to a disciplined, loyal corps of soldiers once the political situation stabilized. His architectural patronage and cultural policies had likewise created enduring symbols of Ottoman power and unity, which remained intact during the empire's darkest years. In a paradoxical way, Bayezid's downfall highlighted the strength of the Ottoman system. It could be wounded, even nearly destroyed, but not easily extinguished. The memory of Bayezid also took on a mythic quality in both Ottoman and European chronicles. For his enemies in the West, he remained the scourge of Christendom, a fearsome ruler whose campaigns had once threatened to pierce the heart of Europe. In Eastern narratives, he was often portrayed as a tragic hero, brilliant, bold, but ultimately undone by his own hubris and by forces beyond his control. His capture by Timur entered folklore, with stories of their interactions circulating in various embellished forms. One had Bayezid being paraded in a golden cage. Another claimed he died by poisoning himself in despair. Whether these accounts were factual or not, they served a literary and psychological function. They reminded future sultans of the thin line between glory and ruin, of the dangers of overreaching ambition without prudent caution. Bayezid's legacy, therefore, was not only in what he achieved, but in the cautionary tale he embodied. When his son, Mehmed I, ultimately emerged victorious in the civil war and restored unity to the empire, he did so with full awareness of the lessons learned during his father's reign. Mehmed reestablished central authority, resumed expansionist policies, and began the work of healing the wounds caused by the Interregnum. He did not reject Bayezid's vision. Instead, he adapted it, tempering its aggressiveness with a more calculated diplomacy. The empire that Bayezid had nearly propelled into superpower status would rise again under his descendants, eventually reaching even greater heights under Suleiman the Magnificent. But the mold had been cast by Bayezid. His reign served as a prototype for imperial grandeur, military innovation, and cultural development, even as it was marred by a dramatic collapse that became etched in historical memory. One of Bayezid's most lasting contributions to Ottoman identity was his role in shifting the empire's focus more firmly toward Europe. Before his reign, Ottoman energies had been largely directed toward consolidating Anatolia and pushing cautiously into Balkan territories. Bayezid's campaigns shattered this cautious approach. He aggressively pushed into Hungary, Wallachia, and the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, laying siege to Constantinople itself in 1394, a siege that would not be completed in his lifetime, but which foreshadowed the eventual conquest of the city by Mehmed II in 1453. Though the siege ultimately failed due to outside intervention and internal distractions, it was a clear signal that the Ottomans were no longer regional players. They were an imperial force with continental ambitions. Bayezid envisioned an empire that spanned two worlds, East and West, Islamic and Christian, and this dual identity would define Ottoman strategy for centuries to come. Bayezid also played a pivotal role in reorienting Ottoman political ideology. Before him, the Ottoman rulers had operated largely as warrior chieftains, grounded in traditional Turkic tribal authority and pragmatic state-building. Bayezid, by claiming the title of Sultan of Rum and asserting his legitimacy as heir to both Seljuk and Islamic imperial traditions, elevated the Ottoman throne to a more sacred and formal status. His court ceremonies became more elaborate, his decrees more centralized, and his vision more universal. These ideological shifts were more than symbolic. They prepared the Ottoman state to assume the role of Caliphate contender in the Islamic world, a claim that would eventually find full expression under the reign of Selim I and his successors. Bayezid laid the ideological groundwork for the Ottomans' later claims to universal Islamic leadership, a mantle that placed them at the heart of global religious and political currents. Culturally, Bayezid's reign marked a blossoming of arts and scholarship that reflected the growing sophistication of the Ottoman court. He invited scholars from Persia, Egypt, and the Arab world to his capital. Literature in Persian and Turkish flourished, and mosques and madrasas became centers of both worship and learning. Poetry, calligraphy, and music were nurtured under his patronage, not as luxury pastimes, but as expressions of imperial prestige and cultural integration. His architectural contributions, especially in Bursa, signaled a new era in Ottoman urban identity. These cities were not just military garrisons or trade hubs. They were symbols of civilizational advancement and imperial permanence. The stylistic choices in his commissioned buildings blended Seljuk, Byzantine, and early Ottoman elements, creating a unique aesthetic that became the hallmark of Ottoman design for generations. Despite the monumental legacy he left behind, Bayezid's downfall remains one of the most sobering episodes in Ottoman history. It encapsulates the perils of unchecked expansion and the unpredictable consequences of political and personal rivalry. In his conflict with Timur, Bayezid underestimated not just the military capabilities of his opponent, but also the deep fractures within his own realm. His rapid conquests had stretched the administrative capacity of the empire, and his treatment of rival Turkish beyliks had sown seeds of resentment that would bloom disastrously in the face of external invasion. Furthermore, the Balkan territories, though subdued, were not entirely integrated and remained restive. When the crisis came, these fault lines split wide open, leaving Bayezid without the unified support he needed to repel the invader. The Battle of Ankara was not just a tactical defeat. It was a systemic unraveling, a moment when the illusion of invincibility collapsed under the weight of reality. Even so, the narrative of Bayezid I cannot be reduced solely to that of a tragic figure. He remains one of the most dynamic and influential Ottoman sultans, a ruler who dared to dream of empire on a scale that few before him had imagined. His reign captured the volatile energy of a state in transition, from principality to empire, from tribal rule to centralized governance, from local authority to global ambition. In many ways, Bayezid I was ahead of his time, a forerunner of the imperial style and vision that would become the Ottoman hallmark. His achievements, though interrupted by catastrophic failure, laid the foundation for the Ottomans' resurgence in the 15th century and their ascension to one of the most powerful empires in world history. Today, the legacy of Bayezid I is visible not only in the stone of the mosques he built or the historical chronicles that recount his victories and defeats, but in the very trajectory of the Ottoman story. His reign is a reminder of how swiftly empires can rise and fall, but also of how enduring their influence can be when rooted in powerful ideas, institutions, and ambitions. Bayezid's thunder may have been silenced in the dusty plains of Ankara, but its echoes continued to shape the destiny of a civilization long after the storm had passed. The Ottoman Interregnum. The Ottoman Interregnum, often referred to as the Ottoman Civil War, was a tumultuous and defining chapter in the early history of the Ottoman Empire, lasting from 1402 to 1413. This period of internal chaos was triggered by the devastating defeat of Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 at the hands of the Central Asian conqueror Timur. Bayezid's capture by Timur did not only result in the temporary collapse of Ottoman central authority, but also plunged the empire into a bitter and protracted power struggle among his sons, each vying for supremacy over the fragmented Ottoman realm. In the void left by Bayezid's imprisonment and subsequent death in captivity, the once unified Ottoman state fractured, threatening to undo decades of imperial expansion and consolidation. The story of the Interregnum is one of fraternal rivalry, diplomatic maneuvering, and military conflict, but it is also a testament to the resilience of the Ottoman political structure that, despite the chaos, would emerge from the crisis stronger and more centralized. As news of Bayezid's defeat spread, the Ottoman territories were thrown into confusion. The administrative and military elite, long accustomed to a strong central figure, were now faced with the challenge of navigating a leadership vacuum. The empire, once expanding aggressively into the Balkans and Anatolia, suddenly found itself vulnerable on all fronts. Christian forces in the Balkans sensed opportunity, while rival Turkish principalities in Anatolia sought to reclaim lands they had previously lost to Bayezid. In this unstable environment, Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Mehmed, and Musa, each staked a claim to the Sultanate, carving out zones of control and establishing rival courts. The result was a fragmented Ottoman state in which brother turned against brother and alliances shifted like sand. Suleiman Çelebi, Bayezid's eldest son, quickly took control of the European part of the empire with his capital in Edirne. His rule was bolstered by diplomatic agreements with the Byzantines and other Christian rulers in the region, who, seeing the Ottomans divided, sought to weaken them further by playing the princes against each other. Isa Çelebi attempted to control the western parts of Anatolia, while Mehmed, the youngest but most astute of Bayezid's sons, established his base in Amasya in the northeast. Musa, after being held for a time by Timur, would later enter the fray as well. The civil war that ensued was brutal and complex. Alliances were formed and broken with dizzying speed. Battles were fought not only with swords, but also with treaties, promises, and betrayals. Local lords, governors, and foreign powers all had roles to play, often shifting their loyalties based on who appeared to have the upper hand. The first significant clashes occurred between Mehmed and Isa in Anatolia. Mehmed, though younger, demonstrated remarkable political and military skill. With a combination of calculated warfare and strategic alliances, he managed to defeat Isa in 1405, consolidating much of Anatolia under his control. However, Mehmed's rise in the east did little to stabilize the empire, as Suleiman continued to assert his dominance in the Balkans. Suleiman, although initially the most powerful due to his control of the European territories and wealth, began to lose support among his military commanders due to perceived excesses and his dependence on Christian allies. This disaffection created an opening that Musa Çelebi would exploit. Musa, having gained release from Timur's court and support from Mehmed, crossed into Europe and began challenging Suleiman's rule. In a dramatic and shifting turn of events, Musa gathered strength and popular support among the Balkan Muslims and Turkish populations dissatisfied with Suleiman's policies. In 1411, Musa confronted Suleiman's forces and decisively defeated him near Edirne. Suleiman was killed and Musa took control of the European portion of the empire. However, power had not yet returned to a single Ottoman hand. Once an ally, Musa soon turned against Mehmed, beginning yet another chapter in the internecine conflict. Musa's reign in the Balkans was marked by a harsh and uncompromising rule. He alienated many of the Christian vassals and former allies who had supported Suleiman, thereby inviting their rebellion. Moreover, his increasing hostility towards Mehmed reignited the civil war, now focused between the two remaining brothers. Mehmed, now firmly established in Anatolia and enjoying the support of many key Anatolian beyliks, prepared for a final confrontation. By 1413, the stage was set for a decisive showdown. The two brothers met in a series of confrontations that culminated in the Battle of Çamurlu near Samokov. Mehmed, using his superior strategy and alliances with both Anatolian and European supporters, routed Musa's forces. Musa was captured and executed, ending the Interregnum and leaving Mehmed as the sole ruler of the Ottoman Empire. With this victory, Mehmed ascended to the throne as Mehmed I, known to history as the Restorer. Mehmed I's reign was defined by the immense task of reunifying and restoring the Ottoman state. The Interregnum had not only fractured the empire politically, but also weakened its military institutions and administrative coherence. Local warlords had grown powerful, and the central authority had been questioned. Yet Mehmed approached the post-war reconstruction with pragmatism and patience. He worked to re-establish control over the wayward Anatolian beyliks, many of which had broken away during the chaos. Through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and selective use of force, Mehmed gradually reabsorbed these territories into the imperial fold. In the Balkans, Mehmed had to tread carefully. Christian vassals who had supported different brothers during the conflict were wary of Ottoman reprisals. However, Mehmed, recognizing the fragility of his newly reclaimed empire, chose reconciliation over retribution. He confirmed the autonomy of certain Christian lords and respected previous agreements, thereby avoiding immediate rebellion and ensuring a degree of stability. In many ways, Mehmed's strength lay in his ability to mend rather than simply conquer. His rule laid the groundwork for a more centralized and stable empire, allowing his successors to pursue further expansion and reform. The Ottoman Interregnum was a period of darkness and uncertainty, but it was also a crucible in which the future character of the empire was forged. The fact that the Ottomans did not collapse entirely during this time is a testament to the institutional resilience that had already begun to take shape in the early decades of their rise. The conflict exposed the dangers of dynastic succession without clear rules, a lesson that the Ottomans would continue to struggle with for centuries, often resorting to brutal measures to prevent future civil wars. Still, the Interregnum taught the early Ottoman rulers the value of political flexibility, the necessity of balancing force with diplomacy, and the importance of a unifying imperial ideology. Mehmed Fuad's restoration of order allowed the Ottoman state not only to survive, but to thrive. His successors, particularly Murad II and Mehmed II, the Conqueror, would go on to transform the empire into one of the most powerful forces in Eurasia. But none of that would have been possible without the painful reckoning and hard-won reunification achieved after the Interregnum. This period of fraternal conflict, while chaotic, helped to clarify the contours of Ottoman governance, highlighting the importance of centralized power and administrative continuity in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire. The scars of the civil war remained, but so too did the lessons deeply etched into the evolving consciousness of the Ottoman ruling class. In the grand narrative of Ottoman history, the Interregnum may seem like a moment of disarray, a footnote in the centuries-long imperial saga. Yet it was in this crucible of internal strife that the Ottomans were forced to prove their durability, adaptability, and capacity for renewal. Out of the ashes of Bayezid's defeat and the fragmentation that followed, emerged a more tempered, resilient state, one that was ready to embrace its destiny on the world stage. The survival and eventual triumph of Mehmed I underscored the enduring strength of the Ottoman state, setting the foundation for a dynasty that would rule for over 600 years. Mehmed I and the Restoration. After the chaos of the Ottoman Interregnum, when the once mighty empire stood on the brink of fragmentation and civil collapse, a new figure emerged from the shadows of discord to piece the broken realm back together. This was Mehmed I, son of Bayezid I, a man born in the midst of empire, yet destined to rebuild what war and ambition had shattered. His path to power was neither direct nor uncontested, for Mehmed did not inherit a throne with ease. He carved it back from ruin, step by calculated step, in what would become one of the most remarkable restorations in Ottoman history. Born in 1389, Mehmed Çelebi was one of the many sons of Sultan Bayezid I, also known as Yildirim, or the Thunderbolt. Bayezid's reign had been marked by rapid expansion, bold conquests, and the centralization of power, but it all came crashing down at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Defeated and captured by Timur, Bayezid's fall set off a violent succession crisis. With the Sultan a prisoner and the empire fractured, his sons turned against each other in a brutal civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum. For over a decade, the empire had no undisputed ruler. Brothers fought brothers, allies shifted with the wind, and the once coherent Ottoman territories splintered into competing fiefdoms. It was in this furnace of familial strife and political ruin that Mehmed was forged into a statesman and warrior. Unlike his brothers, who chased power with reckless ambition, Mehmed adopted a more measured approach. After establishing himself in Amasya, a vital provincial city in Anatolia, he worked to consolidate control over the eastern part of the empire. His legitimacy was rooted in the perception of his wisdom, moderation, and military capability. While his brothers, Isa, Musa, and Suleiman traded victories and defeats across both Asia and Europe, Mehmed bided his time. He waited for openings, for weaknesses to appear in their rule, and when the moment came, he acted with precision. First, he moved against Isa, defeating him in battle and eliminating his claim. Next came Suleiman, who had established himself in Edirne, effectively ruling the European provinces. Mehmed sent his ally and brother Musa to challenge him. While Musa initially succeeded, he soon grew tyrannical and lost support. Realizing the threat Musa now posed, Mehmed crossed into Europe, and in 1413, at the Battle of Çamurlu near Sofia, he defeated and killed his last remaining rival. With Musa's death, the civil war was over. Mehmed I, now the sole surviving son of Bayezid, emerged as the undisputed ruler of a reunified Ottoman state. He was crowned Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, restoring a central authority to a realm that had teetered on the edge of annihilation. But winning a crown was one thing. Holding it, rebuilding what had been lost, and restoring the institutions of empire, those were far greater challenges. Mehmed's reign, spanning from 1413 to 1421, would not be remembered for grand conquests or monumental architecture. Instead, it would be defined by careful reconstruction. He knew the empire's foundation had been shaken, its bureaucracy disjointed, its armies exhausted, and its subjects weary of war. His task was not merely to rule, but to heal. One of his first priorities was reasserting central control. During the Interregnum, local lords, tribal leaders, and even ambitious governors had claimed authority for themselves. Mehmed acted decisively. He reappointed loyal officials, revived the central bureaucracy, and began restoring trust in the Sultanate. His strategy relied not on fear, but on legitimacy, presenting himself not just as a victor, but as the rightful heir to the Ottoman legacy. He fostered relationships with the ulema, the Islamic legal scholars, whose endorsement provided religious credibility. In doing so, he repositioned the Ottoman Sultanate as both a political and spiritual leader in the Islamic world. Yet internal peace could not be ensured without stability abroad. Mehmed inherited an empire that had lost its aura of invincibility. Vassals had defected, enemies had grown bold, and the empire's western frontiers were vulnerable. He moved cautiously but confidently. In the Balkans, he restored Ottoman suzerainty over rebellious territories through both diplomacy and selective force. He renewed alliances, secured border regions, and avoided large-scale conflicts that could overstretch his fragile forces. Rather than seeking expansion, he sought consolidation. This was particularly true in dealing with the Byzantines. During the Interregnum, the Byzantine Empire had regained some autonomy and had supported various Ottoman princes as a means of weakening the empire from within. Instead of launching immediate reprisals, Mehmed chose diplomacy. He understood that a weakened Byzantium was more valuable as a buffer than as a battlefield. His interactions with Constantinople were marked by a delicate balance of pressure and pragmatism, buying time for internal reform. Mehmed also paid close attention to the spiritual fabric of his empire. He encouraged the rebuilding of mosques, madrasas, and religious institutions that had suffered during the years of strife. He supported the dervish orders and Sufi brotherhoods that had historically maintained a strong influence in Anatolian society. These spiritual networks not only provided social cohesion, but also helped legitimize his rule in the eyes of the people. For Mehmed, restoration was not just political, it was cultural and moral. But his reign was not without its trials. Rebellions flared intermittently. In Anatolia, discontent among the Turkoman tribes, fueled by economic hardship and resistance to central authority, required swift and at times harsh responses. Mehmed had to balance the need for order with the risk of further alienation. In the end, his ability to blend conciliation with calculated displays of force proved decisive. He managed to keep the empire from falling into renewed anarchy, and instead slowly knitted it back into a functioning whole. Mehmed's personal character played a pivotal role in this process. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent, calm, and devout. He was not a flamboyant or ostentatious ruler, but rather one marked by reflection and discipline. His court was known for its modesty, a stark contrast to the lavish displays often associated with imperial power. He was a ruler who had witnessed the destructive nature of ambition and had learned to temper his own with patience. Even his military campaigns, though few, were characterized by their strategic focus rather than brute aggression. Perhaps most significantly, Mehmed laid the groundwork for the next great phase of Ottoman expansion. By the time of his death in 1421, the empire was no longer a patchwork of rival princes and splintered provinces. It was a restored polity, still fragile in places, but undeniably reborn. His son, Murad II, would inherit a stronger, more cohesive state, one capable of withstanding future challenges and achieving new heights. In this sense, Mehmed's legacy was not just in what he restored, but in what he made possible. It is easy in historical narratives to focus on the conquerors, the ones who expand borders, lead great armies, and leave behind towering monuments. But empires are not only built by conquest, they are sustained by restoration. Mehmed Friend's greatness lies not in his battlefield exploits, but in his quiet, steady, and determined rebuilding of a fractured realm. He was the glue that mended the shattered pieces of a once great empire. Without his leadership, it is entirely possible that the Ottomans would have remained just another failed dynasty, torn apart by internal conflict. Instead, because of Mehmed Afad, the Ottomans were given a second chance, a chance that would, in time, see them rise to become one of the most powerful empires in world history. His reign, though often overshadowed by the more dramatic episodes before and after, was the turning point. It was the moment when recovery triumphed over ruin and vision overcame chaos. For that, Mehmed I deserves to be remembered not just as a restorer, but as a quiet architect of empire. Murad II and Balkan dominance. In the grand narrative of the Ottoman Empire's expansion, few figures played as pivotal a role in cementing dominance over the Balkans as Murad II. His reign, which spanned from 1421 to 1444 and again from 1446 to 1451, marked a critical transitional period between the foundational efforts of earlier sultans and the explosive conquests of his son, Mehmed II. Murad's leadership was defined not only by his strategic military campaigns, but also by his ability to maintain cohesion within a vast, diverse empire under constant threat from both European coalitions and internal rivalries. Murad II inherited a realm fraught with tension, yet he managed to assert and reinforce Ottoman supremacy in southeastern Europe during a time of great instability and persistent crusader incursions. Murad II was the son of Mehmed I, the restorer of Ottoman unity following the devastating Interregnum. When Murad ascended the throne at a young age, he immediately faced the challenge of reasserting central control. His early reign was anything but peaceful. Rebellions erupted in Anatolia, notably led by rival claimants like Mustafa Çelebi, and his authority was contested by regional warlords and Byzantine intrigues. Murad swiftly showed he was not to be underestimated. He decisively crushed Mustafa's rebellion in 1422 and besieged Constantinople shortly after, a gesture that signaled the revival of Ottoman ambition and might. Though that siege was eventually lifted due to internal revolts, it was a foretaste of Murad's larger strategic intentions in the Balkans and his ability to multitask between different fronts. Murad's primary focus throughout his reign was solidifying Ottoman control over the Balkans, which had been partially conquered under his predecessors but remained unstable due to frequent uprisings and the meddling of Christian powers, particularly Hungary, Venice, and the remnants of the Serbian despotate. He recognized that to secure long-term stability, it wasn't enough to simply capture territory. He needed to pacify, administer, and integrate these lands into the imperial system. His campaigns were marked by a mix of brute force and diplomatic acumen, often leveraging treaties, vassal arrangements, and marital alliances alongside military pressure. One of Murad II's most significant confrontations was with the Kingdom of Hungary and its allies, who viewed the expanding Ottoman power as a direct threat to Christendom. The Balkans were the front line of this civilizational clash. In 1440, Murad launched a major siege of Belgrade, a strategic stronghold controlling access to Hungary's southern frontier. Though the siege failed due to stiff resistance and logistical challenges, it nonetheless demonstrated the seriousness of Ottoman intent and placed the region under persistent psychological and strategic pressure. Despite occasional setbacks, Murad was a master of the long game. His campaigns often involved repeated incursions into Albanian, Serbian, and Bulgarian territories, eroding local resistance while establishing Ottoman garrisons and administrative structures. He methodically broke down resistance in Serbia, culminating in the Battle of Varna in 1444, perhaps the most defining moment of his reign. The battle was the result of a massive crusading campaign led by King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary, supported by various European states, and backed by the papacy. Murad, who had briefly abdicated the throne in favor of his son Mehmed II, was compelled to return to command the army personally when the Crusaders violated a peace treaty and invaded Ottoman territory. At Varna, Murad displayed the full extent of his strategic maturity. Outnumbered and facing a formidable enemy led by a coalition of Christian knights and seasoned commanders, he orchestrated a disciplined and effective counterattack that culminated in the death of King Władysław and the collapse of the Crusader forces. The victory was not just military, it was symbolic. It crushed the European hope of reversing Ottoman expansion and reasserted Ottoman dominance in the region. Murad's return to the throne after this triumph reaffirmed his indispensability and ensured stability at a critical juncture. The Varna campaign also revealed something fundamental about Murad's character and approach to leadership. Though often portrayed as austere and militaristic, he was also pragmatic and deeply conscious of the spiritual and symbolic dimensions of rule. Before the battle, he is said to have prayed earnestly, entrusting the outcome to divine will. His success, then, was interpreted not merely as military prowess, but as a confirmation of the righteousness of the Ottoman cause, a sentiment that further galvanized his troops and solidified loyalty among his subjects. Murad's reign wasn't confined to conquest alone. He invested in strengthening the empire's internal structures, building mosques, schools, and other institutions that deepened Ottoman integration across the Balkan territories. He understood that military dominance was fleeting without administrative control and ideological cohesion. His efforts to promote Islamic learning and judicial reform helped bind the disparate peoples of the Balkans to a larger Ottoman identity, even as they retained elements of their local culture and traditions. The years following the Battle of Varna saw continued consolidation. The Serbian despotate, long a thorn in the side of the Ottomans, was gradually reduced to vassal status. In Albania, however, Murad faced one of his most persistent enemies in the form of Skanderbeg, a local nobleman turned nationalist icon. Despite multiple campaigns, like the mountainous terrain and decentralized resistance led by Skanderbeg proved difficult to overcome fully. Still, Murad managed to keep Albanian resistance largely contained and prevent it from reigniting broader Christian coalitions. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of Murad's rule is his unusual decision to abdicate not once, but twice. After his first abdication in 1444, he returned for the Battle of Varna. Later, in 1446, when his son Mehmed II was once again facing unrest and insubordination from the Janissaries and provincial governors, Murad was recalled from retirement a second time. This rare act speaks volumes about the political instability of the era and the extraordinary personal authority Murad wielded. His presence alone was often enough to restore order, illustrating how tightly the empire's fortunes were bound to his leadership. Murad II finally retired for good in 1451, dying shortly thereafter. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new one under Mehmed II, who would go on to conquer Constantinople and propel the empire to even greater heights. Yet it is crucial to recognize that Mehmed's achievements rested heavily on the foundations laid by his father. Murad's systematic approach to Balkan dominance, his military campaigns, his diplomatic balancing acts, his administrative reforms, all created the conditions that allowed for the rapid expansion and centralization of Ottoman power in the decades to come. In hindsight, Murad II's reign may lack the dramatic flair of his son's conquest of Constantinople, but his contributions were no less vital. He was the steady hand that guided the empire through a period of immense turbulence and transition. He contained the last great crusading effort against the Ottomans and extinguished the illusion that Europe could easily roll back Ottoman advances. His victories, military, diplomatic, and institutional, ensured that the Ottoman grip on the Balkans would remain firm for centuries. Murad was not merely a warrior sultan. He was a consolidator, a restorer, and a visionary in his own right. By the end of his life, the Balkan Peninsula was no longer a fragmented buffer zone between East and West. Under Murad's leadership, it had become a vital core region of the Ottoman realm, a gateway to Europe, and a symbol of imperial resilience. His legacy, though sometimes overshadowed by his more flamboyant successor, remains one of the most essential chapters in the story of Ottoman ascendancy. His quiet determination, his patience in the face of opposition, and his strategic foresight stand as lasting examples of statecraft and leadership in a complex and divided world. Selim the Grim and the Islamic Caliphate. Selim I, often known by the epithet the Grim, or Yavuz Sultan Selim, was a transformative figure in Ottoman and Islamic history. His reign, though short, lasting from 1512 to 1520, marked a dramatic shift not only in the Ottoman Empire's geopolitical orientation, but also in the spiritual leadership of the Islamic world. Under his command, the Ottoman Empire expanded exponentially, stretching its dominion across the heart of the Islamic world. But more importantly, Selim's conquests and his assertive strategies positioned the Ottoman Sultan as the Caliph of Islam, intertwining temporal power with spiritual leadership, a legacy that would define the empire for centuries. Before Selim's ascension, the Ottoman Empire had already established itself as a formidable power in both Europe and Asia. His predecessors had consolidated power in Anatolia and the Balkans, extending Ottoman authority over a diverse and multi-ethnic population. However, the focus had largely been westward, towards Europe. Selim, however, turned his gaze east and south. His reign would fundamentally reorient Ottoman priorities, bringing the Arab Islamic heartlands under Turkish rule for the first time. Yet his path to the throne was neither easy nor bloodless. As was often the case in Ottoman succession traditions, the road to power was paved with intrigue and internal strife. Selim had to overthrow his father, Bayezid II, a ruler of a more pacifistic and contemplative demeanor. Bayezid preferred negotiation and diplomacy, while Selim represented the sharp blade of decisive militarism. Selim challenged not only his father's authority, but also faced off against his brothers in a brutal campaign to secure the throne. By 1512, the internal conflict was resolved in Selim's favor. Bayezid was deposed and exiled, and Selim took the throne with the singular vision of expanding the empire and reshaping its identity. Once in power, Selim's ambitions became immediately evident. He saw the Safavid Empire to the east under Shah Ismail I as a direct threat. The Safavids were not only political rivals, but their adherence to Shia Islam posed an ideological challenge to the Sunni Ottoman state. This sectarian divide was not just theological, it was geopolitical. Selim, deeply Sunni in conviction, viewed the Safavids as heretics, undermining the unity of the Islamic world. This perspective would fuel one of the most critical confrontations of the early 16th century. In 1514, Selim launched a campaign against the Safavids, culminating in the pivotal Battle of Chaldiran. The Ottoman army, equipped with superior artillery and firearms, decisively defeated the Safavids. The victory at Chaldiran not only checked Safavid expansion, but also demonstrated the increasing importance of gunpowder weapons in warfare. Shah Ismail, humiliated and wounded, withdrew into seclusion, and the Safavid threat was significantly diminished for a time. This victory, however, was more than just a military triumph. It sent a message throughout the Islamic world. Selim was positioning himself not just as a sultan, but as a leader of the entire Sunni Muslim Ummah. His next move would be even more transformative. Turning his attention to the south, Selim sought to bring the heartlands of Islam under Ottoman control. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling over Egypt, the Levant, and the Hejaz, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, stood as both a political rival and the nominal spiritual guardian of Sunni Islam. The Mamluks had long been the protectors of the Islamic pilgrimage routes and the custodians of the holy sites. Their defeat would not only add territory to the empire, but would bestow upon Selim the spiritual legitimacy he craved. In 1516, Selim led a massive military campaign against the Mamluks. The campaign was swift and devastating. The Ottomans, again making use of their superior artillery and disciplined infantry, quickly overcame Mamluk resistance in Syria. The Battle of Marj-Dabik in August 1516 was a decisive victory. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Kansu al-Ghawri was killed in battle, and Damascus soon fell to the Ottomans. With Syria under Ottoman control, Selim pressed forward into Egypt. In early 1517, the Battle of Ridania sealed the fate of the Mamluk Sultanate. Cairo fell, and the last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey the Sikh, was captured and eventually executed. The fall of the Mamluk Sultanate had far-reaching consequences. It effectively ended the political independence of the Arab Islamic world. For centuries, the Caliphate had been a fragmented notion, its authority diluted by regional powers. The Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, reduced to symbolic status under the Mamluks, now fell into Ottoman hands. According to later Ottoman tradition, it was during this time that the last Abbasid Caliph, al-Mutawakkil III, formally transferred the Caliphate to Selim I. While some historians debate the historical accuracy of this event, suggesting it may have been a later invention to bolster Ottoman legitimacy, what is clear is that from this point onward, the Ottoman sultans began to style themselves not only as political rulers, but as caliphs, leaders of the entire Muslim world. Selim's acquisition of the holy cities, Mecca and Medina, further cemented his religious authority. By controlling the Hejaz, he took on the role of Qadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, or servant of the two holy sanctuaries. This title was not just ceremonial, it embodied the Ottoman Sultan's commitment to protecting and administering the most sacred sites in Islam. Selim's actions, including the restoration of Islamic infrastructure and securing pilgrimage routes, were seen as signs of a ruler fulfilling his religious duty. Thus, his role as caliph was not merely theoretical, It was grounded in administrative and logistical responsibilities over the Islamic world's spiritual centers. Despite his moniker, the Grim, which reflected his austere personality and sometimes ruthless methods, Selim I was widely respected among Sunni scholars and jurists. His rule was seen as a necessary correction to the perceived laxity and fragmentation of the Islamic world. He reasserted Sunni orthodoxy, supported the ulama, Islamic scholars, and enforced strict policies to suppress heretical practices and ensure doctrinal unity. Yet, this rigid orthodoxy also had its dark side. Selim's reign was marked by mass executions of suspected Shia sympathizers within the empire, especially in Anatolia, where many adherents of Shia Islam lived. These purges, brutal as they were, reflected Selim's belief that religious uniformity was essential for political stability and imperial expansion. Selim's emphasis on religious leadership did not come at the expense of effective governance. He reorganized the administration of the newly acquired Arab territories, integrating them into the Ottoman system without disrupting local customs too severely. He preserved many of the Mamluk institutions in Egypt, recognizing that sudden sweeping changes could alienate the population. His rule in the Arab world was characterized by a blend of Ottoman centralization and pragmatic delegation. Local elites were incorporated into the Ottoman system, given positions of authority, and expected to remain loyal to the Sultan Caliph. This approach ensured a smoother transition and helped legitimize Ottoman authority in the eyes of the conquered peoples. Selim I's reign also saw significant cultural and intellectual developments. Though his reign was too brief to establish long-lasting cultural institutions, his conquests brought the Ottomans into direct contact with the rich intellectual and artistic traditions of the Arab world. Libraries, scholars, and artisans were brought from Syria and Egypt to Istanbul, enriching the empire's cultural life. This transfer of knowledge and tradition helped create the conditions for the later cultural flourishing under Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim's son and successor. In 1520, just 8 years after his rise to power, Selim first died suddenly. Some say of cancer, others suggest poison. Despite the brevity of his reign, the impact of his leadership was monumental. He had more than doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire, reoriented its focus toward the Islamic world, and claimed the mantle of caliph. His legacy would live on not only in the territorial expansion of the empire, but in its ideological foundation. The Ottomans would continue to claim the Caliphate until the very end of the empire in the early 20th century. For nearly 4 centuries, the Ottoman Sultan would be recognized as the Caliph by a significant portion of the Muslim world. Selim Thun's reign represents a turning point in Islamic history. It marked the end of the Mamluk era, the integration of the Arab world into a Turkish-led empire, and the reemergence of the Caliphate as a central institution of Islamic authority. Selim's blend of military brilliance, religious orthodoxy, and administrative pragmatism made him both feared and revered. His policies laid the groundwork for the empire's golden age under Suleiman, and his assumption of the caliphate shaped the Ottoman self-image as the defenders and leaders of Islam. Though some view him as a ruthless conqueror who ruled with an iron fist, others see in Selim the embodiment of a leader who seized the moment to unite a fragmented world under a singular vision. Whether seen through the lens of admiration or critique, Selim remains one of the most consequential figures in the history of the Islamic world. His reign reminds us that empire is not merely about conquest. It is about identity, legitimacy, and the enduring power of belief. His was a rule defined not just by the sword, but by the robe of spiritual authority, worn with equal conviction. And it was that fusion of steel and spirit that truly set Selim the Grim apart as a sultan, a conqueror, and a caliph. In the aftermath of Selim I's death in 1520, his legacy loomed large over the empire he had reshaped. His son, Suleiman I, later known as Suleiman the Magnificent, inherited a realm dramatically transformed. Thanks to Selim's campaigns, Suleiman was not only the political sovereign of a vast empire stretching from Hungary to Yemen, but also the spiritual leader of millions of Muslims across 3 continents. The title of caliph, once dormant and symbolic under the shadow of fading dynasties, had been reinvigorated by Selim's actions and was now tied intrinsically to the Ottoman throne. Yet Selim's path to claiming this mantle had been anything but accidental. It was a carefully calculated blend of theological persuasion, military conquest, and symbolic appropriation. One of the most profound elements of Selim's reign was how he redefined the concept of caliphal authority. Traditionally, the Caliphate had been based on lineage tracing back to the Prophet Muhammad, or at least on a theological consensus among leading Islamic scholars. The Abbasid caliphs in Cairo had retained this claim even though their real power was minimal. When Selim took control of Egypt and reportedly received the sacred relics of the Prophet, including his cloak, sword, and banner, he was doing more than taking trophies. He was laying claim to religious authority through symbols that resonated deeply with the Muslim imagination. These relics, later housed in Topkapi Palace, were displayed as physical validation of the Ottomans' new spiritual leadership. Beyond the relics, the presence of Islamic scholars who accepted Selim's authority was crucial. The ulama, the body of Islamic legal and religious scholars, played an important role in legitimizing Selim's caliphate. Their support was not simply coerced. Many Sunni scholars saw in Selim a unifying figure capable of defending Sunni orthodoxy against the growing threat of Shia expansionism, particularly from the Safavid Empire. In fact, Selim's reign coincided with a moment of deep anxiety within the Sunni Muslim world. Fragmentation, heresy, and internal conflict had created a longing for unity. Selim presented himself not just as a warrior against heresy, but as the protector of Sunni Islam and the champion of Islamic law. Yet, this unification came at a significant cost. The purges carried out under Selim, particularly targeting Shia communities in Anatolia, were not merely political measures, they were framed as religious obligations. Thousands were executed or imprisoned on suspicion of loyalty to the Safavids or deviation from Sunni orthodoxy. While some contemporaries viewed this as necessary for preserving unity, others saw it as a dark stain on Selim's legacy. This aspect of his rule remains one of the most contested by historians. It raises enduring questions about the balance between unity and tolerance, and whether religious authority gained through force can ever truly command moral legitimacy. Selim's engagement with the broader Islamic world extended beyond his military campaigns and theological claims. He actively corresponded with Islamic scholars, jurists, and leaders across different regions. His court welcomed delegations from distant Islamic lands, further reinforcing the image of the Ottoman Sultan as not just a regional power, but a global Islamic leader. He also supported the construction and maintenance of religious institutions across the newly conquered territories. Mosques, madrasas, religious schools, and khanqahs, Sufi lodges, were funded and maintained through state patronage. This infrastructural support was part of a broader policy to consolidate Ottoman rule and to project an image of piety and legitimacy. One of the enduring symbols of Selim's religious authority was his adoption of the title Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, servant of the two holy sanctuaries. This title was deeply significant. While previous Muslim rulers had sought to be seen as protectors of Mecca and Medina, Selim chose the term servant, emphasizing humility before the sacredness of the cities and reinforcing his role as guardian rather than dominator. This nuanced expression of leadership resonated deeply with Muslims across the empire, especially those in the Arab provinces who were skeptical of Turkish hegemony. It was a clever political and religious maneuver that helped smooth the Ottomans' transition from conquerors to custodians. Selim's strategic brilliance also extended to how he handled the integration of non-Turkish Muslim populations into the Ottoman administrative framework. The Arabs of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the Hejaz were brought under Ottoman rule with relatively little resistance after the initial conquests. Selim understood that to govern effectively, the Ottomans needed to respect local customs and work with existing elites. In Egypt, for example, many former Mamluks were incorporated into the new administration. This helped maintain order and avoided unnecessary revolts. It also reinforced the image of the Ottoman Sultan as a legitimate ruler, not a foreign occupier. Additionally, Selim's expansion brought immense wealth into the empire. The control of the spice trade routes, access to Red Sea ports, and the acquisition of Egypt's economic resources significantly bolstered the Ottoman treasury. These gains were not only economic but symbolic. By dominating the trade networks that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe, the Ottoman Empire was positioned as a global commercial hub. This economic strength in turn underpinned the empire's cultural and military might, enabling future sultans to project power far beyond the traditional Islamic world. In many ways, Selim I's reign laid the ideological and logistical groundwork for the Ottoman Empire's peak under Suleiman the Magnificent. The idea of a unified Islamic world under a single caliph became not just an ideal but a reality, however contested it may have been. And while Suleiman would become the more celebrated figure in Western and Islamic historiography, known for his legal reforms, architectural patronage, and cultural achievements, none of that would have been possible without the foundation laid by Selim. It was Selim who turned the Ottomans from a powerful empire into the undisputed leaders of the Islamic world. His militaristic zeal, theological rigor, and unyielding ambition propelled the Ottomans into a new era of religious and geopolitical dominance. Yet Selim remains a paradoxical figure. Revered by some as a hero of Islam, reviled by others for his ruthlessness, his reign defies simplistic categorization. He was deeply devout yet uncompromisingly violent. He claimed spiritual leadership while purging dissenters. He embraced the symbols of Islamic unity while using them as tools of imperial consolidation. This complexity is perhaps what makes Selim Frus one of the most fascinating rulers in Islamic history. His actions reshaped not only a dynasty, but a civilization. They altered the trajectory of Islam, redefining its centers of power, its leadership structures, and its imperial possibilities. In retrospect, Selim's reign was not just a chapter in Ottoman history. It was a fulcrum on which the balance of the Islamic world turned. His ability to merge the sword and the crescent, to wield both temporal and spiritual authority, created a model of caliphal rule that would endure for centuries. And even though the Ottoman Caliphate would face challenges, both internal and external, the symbolism of Selim's conquests and the legacy of his claims to the Caliphate would continue to resonate long after his death. Today, as scholars and students alike explore the complex legacies of Islamic leadership, Selim I stands as a critical figure in understanding how religion and empire have historically intersected. His story is a reminder that leadership in the Islamic world has never been merely about faith or power alone, but about how those two forces collide, converge, and ultimately shape the fate of millions. Selim I the Grim was not merely a conqueror of lands, but a reclaimer of Islamic destiny. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Golden Age. Suleiman the Magnificent, the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, ascended the throne in 1520 and ruled until 1566, presiding over what would come to be regarded as the Golden Age of Ottoman power, culture, and influence. His reign not only marked the apex of territorial expansion, but also saw a flourishing of law, art, architecture, and governance that would shape the legacy of the empire for centuries. Suleiman was not merely a conqueror or a statesman. He was a reformer, a patron of the arts, a poet, and above all, a ruler who understood the necessity of uniting power with vision. Under his leadership, the Ottoman Empire reached unprecedented heights, stretching from the gates of Vienna in the west to the deserts of Arabia in the east, from the steppes of Ukraine in the north to the coasts of North Africa in the south. From the moment he took power, Suleiman demonstrated a strategic mind and a relentless drive. He inherited a strong empire from his father, Selim I, but Suleiman was determined not just to maintain it, but to expand and refine it. Early in his reign, he set his sights on the European theater, a move that would place him in direct competition with the Habsburg dynasty and other European powers. His campaign against Hungary culminated in the decisive Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where the Hungarian army was annihilated and the Hungarian king Louis II was killed, effectively bringing much of Hungary under Ottoman control. This victory marked a turning point, giving Suleiman a strong foothold in Central Europe and changing the balance of power on the continent. Yet Suleiman was not merely a military man. At home, he set about transforming the empire's legal framework, earning him the title Kanuni, or the lawgiver, among his own people. His legal reforms harmonized and codified a vast array of laws that balanced the traditions of Islamic jurisprudence with the needs of a vast, diverse, and multi-ethnic empire. His laws dealt with everything from property rights to criminal justice, taxation, to trade, aiming to ensure justice and order across his sprawling domain. This legal legacy would become a foundation for centuries of governance in the empire, influencing not just the courts but also the daily lives of ordinary people. The Golden Age of Suleiman was also a cultural renaissance. The Sultan himself was a poet who wrote under the pen name Muhibi, and his court attracted the greatest minds, artists, and architects of the era. Chief among them was the legendary architect Mimar Sinan, who transformed the skylines of cities across the empire. Sinan's crowning achievement, the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, remains a marvel of design and engineering, a grand architectural expression of Suleiman's vision for a harmonious, majestic empire. These cultural achievements were not limited to architecture. The arts flourished under Suleiman, from miniature painting to calligraphy, textiles to ceramics. The imperial court became a beacon of refined taste and patronage, blending Persian, Arabic, and Byzantine influences into something uniquely Ottoman. Suleiman's rule also saw significant naval expansion. Under his admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy gained supremacy in the Mediterranean, challenging European fleets and controlling key maritime trade routes. The naval victory at the Battle of Preveza in 1538 secured Ottoman dominance over the Mediterranean for decades. Through naval strength, Suleiman ensured that the empire was not just a land power, but a maritime force capable of projecting influence far beyond its borders. Trade, commerce, and communication across the empire were revolutionized, helping cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Aleppo flourish economically and culturally. In the broader Islamic world, Suleiman was seen as a unifier and protector. He expanded the empire into the Middle East, securing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and thus positioning himself as the Caliph, the religious leader of the Sunni Muslim world. This gave his rule an added spiritual dimension, as he became both a temporal and religious figurehead. His legitimacy in the Islamic world was bolstered by his defense of Sunni orthodoxy against the rising influence of the Shia Safavid Empire in Persia. Suleiman's campaigns against the Safavids were long and arduous, but they affirmed his role as the guardian of Sunni Islam and extended Ottoman influence deep into the Iranian plateau. But Suleiman's golden age was not without its internal challenges. Managing a vast empire came with constant political intrigue, particularly within the palace. The most significant personal and political complication of his reign came from his own family. Suleiman's relationship with his beloved wife, Hürrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, was unprecedented in Ottoman history. Hürrem, a former concubine of Ukrainian origin, became Suleiman's legal wife and wielded extraordinary influence in court affairs. Her rise to power and the subsequent elevation of her sons created a tense environment, culminating in the tragic execution of Suleiman's firstborn son and heir, Mustafa, an act many believed was orchestrated through palace intrigue. This period of internal tension marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Sultanate of Women, where royal women, especially queen mothers and consorts, held significant sway over political decisions. Although controversial, Hürrem's influence helped shape the direction of court politics and foreign alliances. The political maneuverings within the palace reflected a shift in power dynamics, one that would leave lasting effects on the imperial administration in the years after Suleiman's death. Despite personal losses and palace intrigues, Suleiman remained focused on his broader vision for the empire. He understood the importance of legacy and succession, and though some of his choices would later be debated, he left behind a structure robust enough to sustain the empire for over 3 more centuries. His final military campaign, launched at the age of 71 against the fortress of Szigetvar in Hungary, proved to be his last. Suleiman died during the siege in 1566, but his death was kept secret for several weeks to maintain morale among the troops. His body was buried in Istanbul, near the Grand Mosque that bore his name, a city that had become the vibrant heart of a global empire. The impact of Suleiman's reign cannot be overstated. He elevated the Ottoman Empire to a superpower status, not only through conquest and diplomacy, but through the refinement of governance, culture, and law. He expanded the empire's boundaries to their zenith, but more importantly, he created an enduring system of administration and culture that would outlive him by centuries. His reforms in justice and governance influenced legal systems far beyond the empire, and his patronage of the arts and architecture helped define what it meant to be Ottoman. Suleiman's golden age was not merely about expansion or power. It was about the synthesis of ideals, justice and might, tradition and innovation, piety and pragmatism. It was a time when the Ottoman Empire was admired and feared, a time when Istanbul rivaled any European capital in sophistication and grandeur. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled with ambition, but also with an awareness of history and legacy. His vision reached beyond the present, seeking to create not just an empire of territory, but an empire of meaning, and in that he succeeded. His rule remains one of the most illustrious chapters in Islamic and world history, a time when the Ottomans stood not only as conquerors, but as torchbearers of a rich and enduring civilization. The power of the sea, the Ottoman navy, and the Battle of Lepanto. The Ottoman Empire, known for its immense power and reach across 3 continents, was as formidable at sea as it was on land. Its navy, a symbol of imperial dominance and maritime ambition, was a crucial instrument in maintaining control over the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The power of the sea, particularly during the height of Ottoman naval supremacy, showcased the empire's ability to project force, protect trade routes, and challenge European maritime powers. At the heart of this maritime legacy lies the Battle of Lepanto, a monumental clash that not only tested the might of the Ottoman navy, but also marked a significant turning point in the naval history of the Mediterranean. By the mid-16th century, the Ottomans had established themselves as a dominant naval force. Under the leadership of formidable admirals like Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha and later Mazinzadeh Ali Pasha, the Ottoman fleet had swept through the Mediterranean, defeating rivals and asserting control over key territories and sea lanes. The empire's ability to harness shipbuilding innovations, integrate diverse maritime traditions, and mobilize vast resources made its navy a force to be reckoned with. Cities such as Istanbul, Gallipoli, and Alexandria became important shipyards, churning out galleys, galleasses, and logistical vessels to support campaigns and patrol imperial waters. Ottoman naval strategy was deeply intertwined with the broader goals of empire. The sea allowed for rapid deployment of troops, the movement of supplies, and the enforcement of imperial will in regions like North Africa, the Levant, and the Balkans. The fleet was also essential in supporting corsair activity, semi-independent privateers who raided enemy ships and fortified Ottoman interests. These corsairs, often based in Algiers or Tunis, were both feared and respected, and many of them, like Dragut and Uluç Ali, would go on to become high-ranking Ottoman naval officers. However, the maritime dominance of the Ottomans did not go unchallenged. European powers, particularly Spain, the Papal States, and Venice, were increasingly alarmed by the empire's expanding naval presence. The Ottomans' capture of Cyprus from Venice in 1571 was a bold move that further escalated tensions. Cyprus, with its strategic location and economic value, was a prized possession, and its loss was seen as a direct threat to Christian Europe. In response, Pope Pius V formed the Holy League, an alliance of Catholic maritime powers, to confront and neutralize the Ottoman naval threat. The Battle of Lepanto, fought on October 7, 1571, was the culmination of this rising tension. It brought together 2 massive fleets in one of the largest naval battles in history, both in terms of the number of ships and the scale of engagement. On the one side was the Ottoman fleet, commanded by Muezzin-Zadeh Ali Pasha, and consisting of approximately 220 galleys and 60 galleots. On the other side stood the Holy League's combined fleet, led by Don John of Austria, comprising roughly 212 galleys and 6 large galleasses, heavily armed vessels developed by the Venetians. The location chosen for the battle was the Gulf of Patras, near Lepanto, modern-day Naupactos, on the western coast of Greece. The narrowness of the Gulf and the prevailing winds made maneuverability difficult, turning the confrontation into a brutal close-quarters engagement. As dawn broke on the day of the battle, thousands of sailors, soldiers, and rowers braced themselves for the coming storm. The Ottomans formed a crescent-shaped line, a traditional formation aimed at encircling and overwhelming the enemy, while the Holy League's forces were arranged in a tight formation with the galleasses at the front, ready to unleash their formidable firepower. The clash was immediate and ferocious. The galleasses of the Holy League inflicted heavy damage early on, using their artillery to disrupt the Ottoman lines before the galleys closed in for boarding actions. The fighting quickly turned into hand-to-hand combat as soldiers leapt from ship to ship, clashing with swords, axes, and firearms in a chaotic melee. The central front of the battle, where Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha and Don John of Austria faced off, was particularly intense. Ali Pasha's flagship was eventually boarded, and after a fierce struggle, he was killed, and his head displayed as a trophy on Don John's galley, a symbolic blow to Ottoman morale. Despite their valor and experience, the Ottomans began to falter. The loss of their commander, combined with the superior coordination and firepower of the Holy League, led to a collapse of their formation. Many Ottoman ships were captured or sunk, and thousands of sailors and soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. The Holy League emerged victorious, having destroyed or captured over 150 Ottoman vessels and inflicted heavy casualties. It was a staggering defeat for the Ottomans, their first major naval loss in over a century, and it sent shockwaves across the Islamic world and Europe alike. However, while the Battle of Lepanto was a tactical triumph for the Holy League, its strategic impact was more nuanced. In the immediate aftermath, Europe rejoiced. The victory was hailed as a divine intervention and a turning of the tide in the long struggle against Ottoman expansion. Poets, painters, and chroniclers celebrated the battle as a glorious moment for Christendom. The psychological boost it provided was immense, particularly for Venice and the papacy, who had suffered repeated naval setbacks in prior decades. But for the Ottomans, the defeat, though significant, was not crippling. Sultan Selim and his advisors responded swiftly, rebuilding the fleet within a year. New ships were commissioned, new commanders appointed, and the empire's shipyards redoubled their efforts. By 1572, the Ottomans had launched a new fleet that was, in size at least, equivalent to the one lost at Lepanto. The speed and efficiency of this recovery underscored the resilience of the empire's naval infrastructure and the strategic importance the Ottomans placed on maritime power. In the years that followed, the Ottomans continued to maintain a strong naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean. Although they were more cautious in their engagements with Western fleets, they remained dominant in many key regions, and their ability to project power via the sea endured well into the 17th century. The loss at Lepanto had not spelled the end of Ottoman naval ambitions. It had simply recalibrated their approach. Ultimately, the Battle of Lepanto stands as a dramatic moment in the history of naval warfare. It represented the clash of two great civilizations, each seeking to assert control over the same waters. The battle revealed both the limits and the strengths of maritime empires. For the Ottomans, it was a reminder that their dominance could be challenged, but also a testament to their ability to recover from even the most catastrophic setbacks. For Europe, it was a fleeting but powerful assertion of unity in the face of a common adversary. The power of the sea, as demonstrated by the Ottomans, was never just about ships or battles. It was about control, over trade, over communication, over influence. The Ottoman Navy, at its height, symbolized an empire that understood the strategic value of maritime supremacy and invested heavily in sustaining it. Even in defeat, the legacy of the Ottoman fleet lived on, influencing naval doctrine, ship design, and maritime politics for generations. The Battle of Lepanto, while a dramatic rupture, was only one chapter in a much longer story of Ottoman naval resilience and imperial ambition, a story where the sea was both a battlefield and a lifeline, economic growth and internal struggles. Economic growth is often seen as the cornerstone of a nation's progress, a measurable indicator that reflects increased production, higher incomes, and improved standards of living. But behind the sleek graphs and optimistic headlines lies a more complex reality, one where economic growth often walks hand in hand with internal struggles. These struggles, ranging from inequality and corruption to political instability and social discontent, can threaten to undermine the very progress that growth promises. Throughout history and in modern times alike, nations have witnessed how the path to prosperity is rarely smooth. Instead, it is riddled with contradictions, moments of dazzling advancement shadowed by internal tensions that refuse to be ignored. At the core of economic growth lies productivity, the ability of a society to produce goods and services more efficiently over time. This is powered by innovation, investment in infrastructure, expansion of industries, and an increasingly educated workforce. When these elements align, countries experience booms. Factories hum with activity, cities swell with opportunity, and consumer markets flourish. Yet as the economy expands, not everyone benefits equally. In many cases, the fruits of economic growth are concentrated in the hands of a few, creating glaring income gaps. This inequality fuels resentment as vast segments of the population find themselves left behind, despite living in what is technically a prosperous society. This tension between economic prosperity and social disparity often manifests in civil unrest and political discontent. Consider rapidly developing countries where GDP figures impress international observers, yet millions continue to live in poverty. Their frustration becomes fertile ground for populist movements, labor strikes, or even mass protests. Citizens demand not just growth, but inclusive growth, development that translates into better education, healthcare, housing, and employment opportunities for all, not just the privileged elite. When these demands are ignored, governments face not just economic challenges, but crises of legitimacy. Internal struggles also stem from corruption, a disease that thrives in environments where transparency and accountability are lacking. As economies grow and more money flows through systems, opportunities for embezzlement, bribery, and mismanagement also increase. Corruption drains resources away from essential public services and into the hands of a few. Infrastructure projects meant to benefit the many are stalled, underfunded, or poorly constructed due to the siphoning of funds. In such contexts, economic growth becomes a mirage, present on paper, but absent in the daily lives of ordinary people. This undermines trust in public institutions and fuels cycles of instability that can be difficult to break. Another source of internal tension is rapid urbanization. Economic booms often drive rural populations towards cities in search of better jobs and higher living standards. While this influx can energize urban economies, it also places immense pressure on housing, transportation, sanitation, and public services. Inadequate planning leads to the emergence of slums, traffic congestion, pollution, and overburdened healthcare and education systems. Cities become centers of contradiction, offering both dazzling modernity and squalid poverty side by side. The poor and working classes, feeling ignored by development policies, may begin to see economic growth not as a shared achievement, but as a betrayal. Environmental degradation is yet another internal struggle linked to unchecked economic expansion. Industries that boost GDP often do so at the cost of the environment, through deforestation, pollution, overuse of natural resources, and carbon emissions. While these activities may generate short-term gains, the long-term consequences are severe. Poor air quality, contaminated water, and climate-related disasters disproportionately affect low-income communities, exacerbating inequality and triggering new waves of internal displacement. In some regions, this ecological stress even leads to conflict over dwindling resources like arable land or clean water. Moreover, economic growth can sometimes breed complacency among political leaders. A booming economy becomes a shield against criticism, allowing those in power to sidestep deeper issues plaguing the nation. However, this strategy is inherently unstable. When the economy inevitably slows or hits a crisis, whether due to global market shifts, pandemics, or natural disasters, underlying weaknesses that had long been ignored suddenly surface with force. Public patience wears thin, protests ignite, and faith in leadership erodes. The collapse of economic illusions reveals the neglected reality underneath, a nation deeply divided and struggling to hold itself together. Youth disenfranchisement is a particularly potent dimension of these internal struggles. In many growing economies, young people make up a significant portion of the population. They are often educated, connected to global ideas via the internet, and full of potential. But if they cannot find meaningful employment or see a path toward a secure future, disillusionment sets in. A country's most vibrant demographic becomes a source of instability rather than innovation. Frustrated youth may turn to protests, emigration, or even radical ideologies. The failure to harness this demographic dividend into economic participation represents a missed opportunity and a growing threat. Similarly, marginalized communities often experience the dark side of growth. Ethnic, religious, or regional minorities may be systematically excluded from economic opportunities or discriminated against in policy implementation. This exclusion builds resentment and can fuel separatist sentiments or social fragmentation. Economic growth that does not include all sections of society only serves to deepen existing divisions. Real stability comes from unity, and unity requires equity, something that cannot be achieved with growth alone. In democratic societies, the pressure to maintain economic momentum can even distort the political landscape. Leaders may prioritize short-term economic performance over long-term social reforms, fearing electoral consequences. This leads to policies that favor quick returns, tax breaks for big businesses, deregulation, or cuts to social spending, rather than structural changes that take time but promote lasting equity. The pursuit of growth at all costs can erode the very democratic values that allowed that growth in the first place. Authoritarian regimes, on the other hand, may use economic success to justify political repression. By pointing to rising GDP and new infrastructure, they silence dissent and centralize power. But this approach, too, is fragile. Without political freedom, corruption festers unchecked. Without free media, policy failures go unreported. Eventually, the pressure cooker of suppressed discontent explodes, often catching even the most powerful leaders by surprise. Economic growth, in these cases, delays internal collapse but cannot prevent it. Even globalization, so often championed as the engine of economic advancement, can intensify internal struggles. As local industries face foreign competition, jobs are outsourced or automated, leaving workers displaced. Cultural identities are challenged by foreign influences, creating generational divides and political polarization. While international trade brings wealth, it also exposes a country to global market volatility. A financial crisis in one part of the world can ripple across economies, revealing how dependent growth has become on external factors and how vulnerable that makes nations internally. In times of crisis, whether economic or social, internal cohesion becomes the true measure of a nation's strength. Economic growth, while essential, must be accompanied by robust institutions, inclusive policies, and a commitment to justice. Nations that manage to balance prosperity with fairness create resilience. They become more than just growing economies, they become stable societies. In the end, economic growth is not inherently good or bad. It is a tool, a force, a means to an end. Whether it brings progress or pain depends entirely on how it is managed and who it serves. Growth that prioritizes only profits and ignores people is a recipe for division. But growth that includes all, uplifts the marginalized, protects the environment, and strengthens institutions. This is the foundation of lasting peace and prosperity. So as we marvel at rising skyscrapers and impressive statistics, let us not forget to ask, who is being lifted by this growth and who is being left behind? What is the cost of our progress, and are we willing to pay it with our unity, our environment, or our values? These are the questions that must shape the future. Because in the story of every nation, economic growth is just one chapter. The struggle to ensure that growth brings justice, equity, and true well-being for all. That is the story that truly matters. The Second Siege of Vienna and Ottoman decline. In the year 1683, the fate of Europe and the Ottoman Empire collided in a moment that would forever mark the beginning of a long and irreversible decline. The great city of Vienna, the seat of the Habsburg dynasty and a symbol of Christian Europe, stood once again as the final barrier between the advancing armies of the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Western Europe. It was not the first time Vienna had faced the Crescent Moon's siege, but this time the stakes were even higher. The Ottoman Empire, under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, had assembled one of the largest military forces Europe had ever seen. Their objective was bold yet clear: to break through Vienna's walls, conquer Central Europe, and restore the empire's prestige in an era where cracks were beginning to show beneath its mighty surface. The Ottomans were no strangers to European conquest. For centuries, they had marched triumphantly from Anatolia to the Balkans, capturing Constantinople in 1453 and transforming it into Istanbul, the proud capital of a vast and multicultural empire. Their military might was legendary, their system of governance efficient, and their cultural achievements renowned. But by the late 17th century, the tides of power had begun to shift. Europe was modernizing, Nations like France, Austria, and the Dutch Republic were growing stronger, both economically and militarily. The Ottomans, once the torchbearers of innovation, were slowly falling behind. The campaign that led to the Second Siege of Vienna was ambitious, grand, and ultimately catastrophic. Kara Mustafa Pasha, determined to achieve personal glory and imperial greatness, mobilized over 150,000 men, a coalition of Ottoman regulars, janissaries, and vassal troops from Wallachia, Moldavia, and the Crimean Khanate. With this force, he advanced through Hungary, capturing strongholds and consolidating his supply lines. His eyes were firmly set on Vienna, the prize that would elevate his name into history. But ambition, unchecked by realism, would soon prove fatal. Vienna in 1683 was not unprepared. Though its garrison was relatively small, fewer than 20,000 defenders, it was led by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a capable and resolute commander. The citizens and soldiers of Vienna braced for a siege they knew would test every ounce of their endurance. The walls of the city were reinforced, food stores were rationed, and hope rested on the distant promise of a relief force. That force came in the form of the Holy League, a coalition of Christian states formed under the guidance of Pope Innocent V. At its head stood one of history's great military figures, King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. For 2 long months, the Ottomans pounded Vienna with relentless artillery and undermined its walls with explosives. Hunger and disease festered inside the city, but the defenders held firm. Kara Mustafa, perhaps overconfident in his numerical advantage, delayed a full-scale assault, hoping to weaken the city further. That hesitation would be his undoing. In September 1683, Sobieski and his 70,000-strong relief army arrived. Composed of Polish, Austrian, German, and Bavarian troops, the coalition approached Vienna from the surrounding hills. What followed was one of the most decisive battles in European history. On September 12th, the Battle of Vienna erupted with thunderous ferocity. Sobieski, leading the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, over 18,000 mounted men, swept down the Kahlenberg Heights and smashed through the Ottoman lines. The battle raged for hours, but by the end of the day, the Ottoman camp was in ruins. Kara Mustafa's dream of conquest shattered. The Ottomans fled in chaos, abandoning cannons, gold, and glory. Vienna was saved, but more importantly, the illusion of Ottoman invincibility was broken. The defeat at Vienna marked a turning point. Though the Ottomans would continue to fight and defend their territories for decades to come, they would never again launch such an ambitious offensive into Europe. The empire, once an ever-expanding force, began to stagnate. Internally, the failure exposed the deepening rot at the heart of Ottoman governance. Kara Mustafa Pasha was executed by imperial order, a scapegoat for a dream gone wrong. But the real causes ran deeper: military complacency, administrative corruption, and resistance to reform. The loss at Vienna also accelerated the geopolitical shift in Europe. The Holy League pushed further into Ottoman territory, reclaiming Hungary and other vital regions. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized these losses, stripping the Ottomans of significant holdings in Central Europe. For the first time, the empire had to cede major lands to Christian powers. The myth of Ottoman dominance, carefully cultivated for centuries, was crumbling. A new Europe was emerging, one increasingly defined by powerful nation-states, scientific progress, and centralized authority. Yet the decline of the Ottoman Empire was not merely military, it was civilizational. While Europe embraced the Enlightenment, printing presses, and modern science, the Ottomans struggled with reform. Their bureaucratic systems became bloated, their military outdated, and their economy burdened by inefficiency and debt. Religious conservatism often clashed with the demands of modernization. Attempts at reform were often met with resistance from entrenched elites who feared losing privilege. The Janissaries, once the empire's elite troops, had become politically powerful and militarily ineffective, resisting change even as enemies grew stronger at the borders. The Second Siege of Vienna became more than a failed military campaign. It became a symbol of transition. The Ottoman Empire had reached the height of its territorial expansion, and from this point forward, it would be forced into a defensive posture. Across the empire, cracks deepened. Local governors became more autonomous, tax collection grew erratic, and public trust in leadership eroded. The center could no longer hold. While the empire still projected power from North Africa to Arabia and the Caucasus, its foundations were weakening. In the aftermath of the defeat at Vienna, the Ottoman Empire faced an identity crisis. The imperial dream of spreading its influence across Europe had not only been halted, it had been violently thrown into reverse. In many ways, the defeat exposed how far the empire had drifted from the disciplined, strategically savvy power it once was under sultans like Mehmed II or Suleiman the Magnificent. These earlier rulers had overseen a system that balanced religious pluralism with military efficiency, administrative sophistication with cultural flowering. But by the late 17th century, that system had eroded, and the sultans themselves were increasingly isolated behind palace walls, shielded from the realities of their empire by court intrigue and eunuch advisors. One of the most glaring indicators of decline was the rise of factionalism within the imperial court. Decisions were no longer made for the good of the empire, but were shaped by the ambitions of court elites, viziers, and the Janissary corps. The Janissaries, once the backbone of the Ottoman military machine, had evolved into a powerful and politicized force that resisted modernization. They could make or break a sultan, and their self-interest frequently clashed with the needs of the state. Their resistance to military reforms, especially the adoption of European-style tactics and weapons, meant the Ottomans were increasingly unprepared for the evolving nature of warfare. Meanwhile, across Europe, the momentum had shifted. The Habsburgs, once desperate to defend their borders, now pushed outward. The Holy League launched a series of counter-offensives known as the Great Turkish War, which lasted until 1699. In battles across Hungary and the Balkans, Ottoman forces were driven back. The siege mentality that had once defined European states was now reversed. The Ottomans became the besieged, defending cities and fortresses that had been theirs for generations. The once proud empire, whose armies had ridden through the gates of Belgrade, Buda, and beyond, now found itself retreating. And yet, for many within the empire, the significance of this transformation was not fully understood. The imperial ideology that had sustained Ottoman expansion still held sway in the minds of many leaders. There was a belief, almost theological in nature, that the empire's greatness was ordained, that temporary setbacks were merely tests of divine will. But this faith could not mask the changing realities. Economically, the empire was under increasing strain. The cost of constant warfare, the loss of valuable tax revenues from conquered territories, and the inability to keep up with European advancements in finance and trade were beginning to suffocate the state. Commerce, once a cornerstone of the Ottoman world, also began to falter. European maritime powers had found new routes to Asia, bypassing the old land-based trade networks that had enriched Ottoman cities like Aleppo and Cairo. As European ships sailed directly to India, China, and the Americas, the Ottoman Empire was increasingly cut out of the global trade web. Smuggling, corruption, and administrative inefficiency further damaged the economic engine. The empire's revenues declined, while military expenses continued to rise. Inflation, driven by the influx of New World silver into Europe, added to the instability. The cultural vitality of the empire dimmed as well. While the 16th century had seen an explosion of art, literature, and architectural brilliance, the post-Vienna period was marked by stagnation. Intellectual life became more insular, more rigid. Religious orthodoxy dominated, and many scholars turned inward, away from the scientific revolutions transforming Europe. The printing press, embraced across Europe as a tool of enlightenment and mass education, was heavily restricted in the Ottoman world for centuries out of fear it would undermine religious authority. It wasn't until the 18th century that printing in Arabic script was officially permitted, by which point the gap in knowledge and dissemination was vast. Externally, the empire still looked formidable. Its lands stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the North African coast to the shores of the Caspian. But power on the map does not always reflect strength on the ground. The Ottomans had become increasingly reliant on local rulers and regional militias to maintain order. In provinces like Egypt, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia, real power often rested not in the hands of Istanbul-appointed governors, but with entrenched local elites who governed like kings in all but name. The central government, bloated and often corrupt, could not impose its will as it once had. The symbolic loss at Vienna reverberated far beyond the battlefield. It marked the beginning of a psychological shift both within the empire and among its enemies. In Christian Europe, the victory was hailed as a sign of divine favor. For centuries, the Ottoman threat had loomed large in European imagination, relentless, unconquerable. But now, the myth had been broken. The siege became a rallying point for further coalitions, further wars. It was no longer just about defending Europe, it was about rolling back the Ottoman presence entirely. In the Ottoman psyche, Vienna became a haunting symbol of overreach. The empire had dared to knock on the gates of Western Christendom once more, only to be turned away, humiliated, and shattered. The lesson was not lost, but nor was it easily accepted. For decades after, Ottoman sultans and viziers would struggle to reconcile their imperial identity with the new realities of containment, defeat, and decline. Reform efforts, military, administrative, and economic, would come and go, often half-hearted or sabotaged by vested interests. The story of the Second Siege of Vienna is not just one of military defeat. It is the story of a turning point in world history, when the balance of power began to shift definitively away from the Islamic empires of the East toward the increasingly aggressive and technologically advanced states of the West. It is a moment where ambition outpaced capacity, where political fragmentation undermined grand strategy, and where the inability to adapt to changing times began to exact an irreversible cost. This was not the end of the Ottoman Empire, not yet. It would survive for more than 2 centuries after the Vienna debacle. It would reform, regroup, and even win battles. But the trajectory had changed. The empire was no longer expanding. It was contracting politically and spiritually. And though its borders would still cast a long shadow over Europe and the Middle East, the internal machinery of power had begun to rust. It would take more wars, more defeats, and more bitter lessons before the full consequences of that September day in 1683 were understood. As the Ottomans reeled from the loss at Vienna, a broader geopolitical transformation was underway, one that would continue to isolate and weaken the empire. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, signed after nearly 2 decades of fighting, forced the Ottoman Empire to formally cede large territories in Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of Croatia and Slavonia to the Habsburgs. This marked the first major territorial concession the empire had ever made to Christian Europe. For the Ottomans, it was more than a military loss. It was an ideological rupture. The once unthinkable notion that the empire could shrink had become a legal and diplomatic reality. Internally, the Ottomans struggled to process this shift. The concept of Dar al-Islam, or the abode of Islam, had long informed the empire's worldview. Lands once conquered and ruled under Islamic law were not to be surrendered without profound spiritual crisis. Yet the terms of Karlowitz demanded precisely that. Sultans, religious leaders, and the general population alike had to grapple with the emotional and theological weight of defeat. Confidence in the divine destiny of the empire faltered, and this uncertainty crept into every layer of governance. At the heart of the empire, the sultans themselves were changing. Gone were the days of warrior leaders who rode at the head of armies. The palace culture had become more secluded, more ceremonial. Sultans now often ascended the throne with limited experience in statecraft or military command. Decisions were increasingly delegated to grand viziers and advisors who operated within a closed circle of court politics, removed from the realities of the empire's periphery. While some viziers, like Köprülü Mehmed Pasha and his son Fazıl Ahmed, tried to revive the state with energy and reform, these efforts were isolated and temporary. The bureaucracy had grown immense, but effectiveness had declined. The Janissaries, once reformable and disciplined, had degenerated into a hereditary caste more concerned with profit than service. They were heavily involved in commerce, bribery, and even urban unrest. Attempts to restructure or replace them with modern-style armies often ended in revolt. In one case, when Sultan Selim III tried to form a Western-style military corps, the Nizam-e-Chedid, the Janissaries rebelled and deposed him. This pattern of resistance to modernization would continue into the 19th century, stalling every serious attempt to transform the military into something capable of matching European armies. Meanwhile, the provinces of the empire were becoming increasingly difficult to control. In the Arab territories, local notables, known as Ayan, were taking more responsibility for tax collection and local governance. In North Africa, the Barbary states of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli were only loosely under Ottoman suzerainty. The empire's eastern borders faced threats from Persia under the Safavids and later the Afsharids. The Balkan territories, while still under Ottoman control, were deeply restive and increasingly influenced by the growing wave of nationalism that would later sweep the continent in the 19th century. The economy continued to deteriorate. Inflation eroded the value of coinage, while corruption drained resources from the treasury. Trade had shifted away from the land routes the Ottomans traditionally controlled, further weakening state revenues. European companies, especially those of Britain, France, and the Netherlands, secured favorable trade capitulations, known as capitulations, which exempted them from many local taxes and laws. These agreements were meant to foster trade, but in the long run, they undercut Ottoman economic sovereignty and gave European merchants vast privileges on Ottoman soil. The empire's failure to industrialize was another crucial factor in its decline. As the Industrial Revolution swept across Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, transforming economies, militaries, and societies, the Ottoman Empire lagged behind. Factories were few, infrastructure was outdated, and scientific education was minimal. The absence of a middle class with access to capital and innovation stifled entrepreneurship. Modern banks, railroads, and communication networks arrived late and were often foreign-controlled. The Ottoman state increasingly depended on European loans, which came with political strings attached. Yet, even in decline, the empire remained a potent symbol and a player in global politics. It retained vast resources, a large population, and strategic geography. European powers, though critical of the sick man of Europe, were still deeply invested in maintaining the Ottoman status quo. Britain, France, and Russia each had their own reasons to support or undermine the empire, leading to a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and treaties. The Ottoman Empire thus became a central figure in the so-called Eastern Question, a diplomatic struggle over what would become of its territory should it collapse. Religiously and socially, the population of the empire remained diverse but fragmented. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived under the millet system, which allowed communities a degree of autonomy in exchange for loyalty to the Sultan. This system worked for centuries, but it also prevented the emergence of a unified Ottoman identity. As nationalism spread from Western Europe into the Balkans and the Middle East, these communal divisions became fault lines. Serbs, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, and others began to see themselves less as Ottoman subjects and more as distinct nations with claims to self-rule. The seeds of this disintegration had been planted long before, but the loss at Vienna catalyzed the process. Had the Ottomans captured the city, the trajectory of European history might have been dramatically different. But they did not. Instead, the failure revealed the brittle nature of imperial ambition that was no longer supported by military, economic, or intellectual strength. And as one war followed another, the empire found itself reacting rather than initiating, defending rather than expanding. Despite this decline, it is important to understand that the Ottoman Empire was not merely fading, it was transforming. While much of this transformation was painful and uneven, it laid the groundwork for the reforms of the 19th century, known as the Tanzimat. These reforms aimed to modernize the military, legal, and educational systems and to create a more centralized, efficient government. They represented a final attempt to revive imperial strength and prevent total collapse. But the memory of Vienna loomed large, a constant reminder of the moment when the empire's ambitions had outstripped its capabilities. The Second Siege of Vienna became a defining symbol in both Western and Eastern narratives. In the West, it represented the moment when Christian Europe held the line and began to push back. In the Ottoman imagination, it marked the end of an age, the end of uninterrupted conquest, the beginning of retreat. It is a story not only of battlefield defeat, but of psychological reckoning. And as the centuries passed, the echo of cannon fire outside Vienna's walls would become a ghost that haunted the empire's long twilight. Military reforms and the Russo-Turkish Wars. The story of the Russo-Turkish Wars is inseparable from the evolution of the Ottoman Empire's military structure. These wars, stretching over centuries, revealed not just the ambitions of two rival empires, but the urgent need for modernization within the Ottoman ranks. At the heart of this struggle was a series of military reforms, efforts to adapt to changing technologies, strategies, and the political realities of an increasingly Europeanized battlefield. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, gradually found itself outmaneuvered and outgunned, its once mighty Janissary corps growing increasingly obsolete in the face of modern warfare. These wars, while brutal and costly, served as a crucible in which the Ottoman state tested, and sometimes failed, to reinvent its military might. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman military was still relying heavily on traditional methods of warfare. The Janissaries, originally an elite infantry force composed of converted Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, had grown deeply entrenched in power and corruption. Once a formidable professional army, they had by now become resistant to reform, fiercely protective of their privileges, and often more interested in political machinations than battlefield excellence. This ossification became increasingly apparent in the face of rising Russian power. Russia, under rulers like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, was rapidly modernizing its military, drawing heavily from Western European models. It became clear to many within the Ottoman elite that unless reforms were implemented, the empire would continue to lose ground, both figuratively and literally. The Russo-Turkish wars, spanning from the 17th to the 19th centuries, were more than just military confrontations. They were an ongoing test of resilience and adaptation. The first major wake-up call came in the late 17th century, when the Ottomans suffered defeats that culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This treaty marked the beginning of Ottoman territorial losses in Europe. It was a psychological shock for an empire that had once marched unchallenged to the gates of Vienna. This defeat planted the seeds of reform, but change was slow, hampered by internal resistance and the complex nature of the Ottoman bureaucracy. It wasn't until the reign of Sultan Selim III in the late 18th century that serious efforts at reform began to take shape. Inspired by European military systems, Selim introduced the Nizami Sedid, or New Order Army. This force was meant to be a modern, disciplined, and well-equipped counterpart to the declining Janissary Corps. It received training from European advisors and was outfitted with modern weapons. However, the existence of this parallel army angered the Janissaries, who saw it as a direct threat to their power. In 1807, they revolted and deposed Selim, effectively halting his reform efforts. His failure was a harsh reminder that military reform in the Ottoman context could not be separated from political power dynamics. Nevertheless, the need for reform became ever more pressing as the 19th century unfolded. The Russo-Turkish wars of the 19th century were particularly devastating, underscoring the empire's growing military inferiority. In the War of 1828 to 1829, the Russian army achieved several major victories, including the occupation of parts of eastern Anatolia and the Balkans. The Ottoman forces, though still numerous, were plagued by poor leadership, outdated tactics, and logistical chaos. The peace that followed, resulting in the Treaty of Adrianople, handed Russia significant territorial and political gains. The Ottomans could no longer ignore the need for a fundamental transformation of their military apparatus. This realization gained new momentum during the Tanzimat period, a sweeping set of reforms initiated in the 1830s and continuing through the 1870s. Under the leadership of reform-minded sultans like Mahmud II, the Janissary Corps was finally abolished in 1826 in a violent episode known as the Auspicious Incident. Mahmud replaced them with a new, centralized army modeled on European standards. Western military advisors, particularly from France and later from Germany, played an increasingly prominent role in training and organization. Uniforms, drills, and command structures were standardized. The aim was not only to create a more effective military, but to centralize authority under the Sultan and weaken the influence of rival power centers. These reforms bore mixed results. On one hand, the Ottoman military did become more professional and better organized. On the other hand, the empire was still grappling with widespread corruption, a fragmented command structure, and the sheer scale of modernization required. The Crimean War of 1853-1856, in which the Ottomans allied with Britain and France against Russia, offered a temporary reprieve. With Western assistance, the Ottoman military was able to hold its ground. The war was notable not only for its geopolitical implications, but also for highlighting the critical role of modern logistics, communications, and medical services, areas where the Ottomans still lagged behind. However, the most revealing test came with the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, perhaps the most disastrous of all. The war began with Russia proclaiming itself the protector of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule, using this as a pretext to launch a broad offensive across the Balkans and into eastern Anatolia. Despite having undergone decades of reform, the Ottoman military was still unable to match the well-coordinated and modernized Russian forces. The battles around Plevna, Kars, and Erzurum were brutal and showcased both the bravery and the limitations of the Ottoman troops. Plevna, in particular, became a symbol of Ottoman resistance, where Osman Pasha held out against overwhelming Russian forces for months, earning admiration across Europe. But courage alone could not compensate for strategic shortcomings. The war ended with a humiliating defeat for the Ottomans and the signing of the Treaty of San Stefano, which was later revised at the Congress of Berlin. The Ottomans lost vast territories in the Balkans, including most of Bulgaria, which gained autonomy, while Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro achieved full independence. The defeat once again highlighted the shortcomings of the military, but it also underscored the urgency of continuing reforms. This led to a deeper reliance on German military advisors in the following decades, particularly under Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The Prussian model of military organization was increasingly adopted, bringing with it not only new tactics, but a more rigid and hierarchical structure. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman military had undergone significant transformation. Its uniforms, weaponry, and command structures more closely resembled those of a European army than the traditional forces of centuries past. Yet the transformation was never complete. Financial constraints, regional rebellions, and a vast multi-ethnic empire all hindered the effectiveness of reform. The Ottoman military remained a paradox, at once modern and medieval, centralized and fragmented, capable of heroism but often undone by its own internal contradictions. The Russo-Turkish Wars thus played a dual role in Ottoman history. On the one hand, they were a recurring source of military humiliation and territorial loss. On the other, they acted as catalysts for some of the most significant military reforms the empire had ever attempted. The repeated confrontations with Russia forced the Ottoman leadership to look outward, to study, imitate, and eventually internalize European military practices. These efforts, though uneven and frequently disrupted, laid the groundwork for the later reforms of the Young Turk era and the eventual transformation of the Ottoman military into the backbone of the emerging Turkish Republic. In the final analysis, the story of military reforms and the Russo-Turkish Wars is one of struggle against an external rival, but more importantly, a struggle within. It was a battle between the forces of tradition and the demands of modernity, between entrenched interests and visionary reformers. Though the Ottomans lost many battles on the field, the reforms they initiated would echo beyond the battlefield, shaping not just the fate of an empire, but the contours of the modern Middle East. The legacy of these wars and the reforms they inspired remains etched into the military and political DNA of the region to this day. The Tanzimat Reform Westernization. The Tanzimat reforms, spanning from 1839 to 1876, represented one of the most ambitious attempts at modernization and westernization in the history of the Ottoman Empire. At a time when the empire was grappling with internal decline and increasing pressure from European powers, the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization in Turkish, was both a desperate response and a bold vision. It was not merely a series of legal and administrative changes. It was a transformative movement that aimed to reshape Ottoman society from the top down. Spearheaded by reformist sultans and enlightened bureaucrats, the Tanzimat era was marked by sweeping efforts to centralize power, promote equality, and emulate European models of governance, law, education, and infrastructure. Yet it was also fraught with contradictions, resistance, and unintended consequences, all of which played a critical role in shaping the final century of Ottoman rule. The roots of the Tanzimat reforms can be traced back to the empire's growing awareness of its comparative weakness in relation to European powers. The military defeats of the 18th and early 19th centuries exposed the Ottoman military's outdated tactics and equipment. More significantly, they revealed a structural weakness in the Ottoman state's ability to project authority and adapt to modern geopolitics. The loss of territories in the Balkans and the mounting interference of Russia and other European powers created an urgent need for reform. Internally, the empire faced increasing unrest from its diverse populations, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, many of whom were disillusioned with the existing system of millet-based governance that maintained religious divisions and perpetuated inequality. The Tanzimat was seen as a way to address these pressing issues by adopting elements of the Western state model while preserving the empire's core identity. The declaration of the Gülhane Edict in 1839 by Sultan Abdülmecid I marked the official beginning of the Tanzimat. This edict promised guarantees for life, property, and honor to all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion or ethnicity. It sought to establish a legal system where all citizens would be treated equally, signaling a radical departure from the traditional Islamic legal framework that privileged Muslims over non-Muslims. This move was not only symbolic but also practical. By aligning with European standards of justice and governance, the Ottoman Empire hoped to reduce foreign interference in its internal affairs. European powers, especially Britain and France, had long used the mistreatment of Christian minorities as a pretext for intervention. By demonstrating that the empire was taking steps toward equality and modernization, the Tanzimat aimed to neutralize these diplomatic pressures. In the decades that followed, the reforms expanded to include wide-ranging changes in administration, military organization, education, and economic policy. The establishment of new secular schools aimed at producing a modern bureaucratic class marked a decisive shift in the empire's educational priorities. These schools taught subjects like mathematics, science, and European languages, and were designed to cultivate a new generation of civil servants loyal to the state rather than religious institutions. The traditional madrasas, long the backbone of Islamic education, began to lose their centrality. Meanwhile, the military underwent significant restructuring along European lines with the adoption of new training methods, uniforms, and command structures. The creation of modern police forces and a more centralized bureaucracy enabled the state to extend its reach deeper into the provinces, standardizing tax collection and suppressing local revolts more effectively. The legal reforms of the Tanzimat period were particularly groundbreaking. The introduction of the Ottoman Penal Code, modeled on the French legal system, and the establishment of mixed civil courts were key milestones. These courts allowed Muslims and non-Muslims to be tried under the same legal framework, thereby reinforcing the principle of legal equality. The development of a codified legal system also helped reduce the arbitrary power of local officials and religious judges. In many ways, these reforms laid the groundwork for the later emergence of a secular legal tradition in the region. However, the attempt to impose uniform laws across a deeply diverse empire also generated friction. Many Muslims perceived these changes as a betrayal of Islamic values, while some non-Muslims remained skeptical of the sincerity of the reforms, suspecting that they were mere window dressing designed to appease European observers. Economically, the Tanzimat reforms sought to modernize the Ottoman financial system and attract foreign investment. New commercial laws were enacted to facilitate business transactions and protect property rights. The empire encouraged the development of banks, railways, and telegraph lines, often in collaboration with European companies. These infrastructure projects not only symbolized progress, but also tightened the state's grip over far-flung territories. However, modernization came at a cost. The influx of European capital often led to dependency, with large portions of revenue allocated to servicing foreign debt. By the latter half of the 19th century, the empire's financial sovereignty had eroded to the point where European creditors held significant influence over Ottoman economic policy through the establishment of the Public Debt Administration. The social fabric of the empire also began to shift under the weight of reform. The emphasis on equality and secular governance challenged long-standing hierarchies and identities. For the urban middle classes, particularly those who benefited from new educational and economic opportunities, the Tanzimat offered a pathway to upward mobility. But for traditional elites, such as the ulama, religious scholars, and provincial notables, the reforms were often seen as a threat to their power and way of life. This tension manifested in episodes of resistance and rebellion, particularly in regions where the reforms were perceived as externally imposed or culturally alien. Moreover, the reforms inadvertently stimulated new forms of nationalism. By promoting the idea of a single Ottoman citizenship that transcended religious and ethnic lines, the Tanzimat aimed to foster unity. Yet, in practice, it often heightened communal tensions, as different groups interpreted the reforms through the lens of their own aspirations and grievances. Westernization during the Tanzimat period was not limited to institutions. It also extended to culture and daily life. European styles of dress, architecture, and literature began to permeate urban centers like Istanbul, Izmir, and Beirut. The rise of print media and translations of Western novels introduced new ideas about individualism, freedom, and progress. Ottoman intellectuals such as Namık Kemal and Ziya Pasha emerged as prominent voices advocating for liberalism, constitutionalism, and civil rights. These thinkers were deeply influenced by European Enlightenment ideals, but they also sought to reconcile them with Islamic and Ottoman traditions. Their writings helped ignite a broader cultural awakening that would culminate in the Young Turk movement at the turn of the 20th century. Despite its ambitions and achievements, the Tanzimat era did not resolve the fundamental problems facing the Ottoman Empire. While it succeeded in modernizing certain aspects of governance and society, it fell short of creating a cohesive and stable polity. The reforms were often inconsistently implemented and resisted by various segments of society. Moreover, the central government's inability to fully integrate diverse populations under a unified identity meant that communal tensions persisted, and in some cases, intensified. By the end of the Tanzimat period in 1876, the empire had adopted a constitution and convened a parliament, only to see both suspended shortly thereafter by Sultan Abdülhamid II in favor of autocratic rule. This marked the end of the Tanzimat's most liberal phase and the beginning of a more repressive era. Nonetheless, the legacy of the Tanzimat reforms endured. They planted the seeds for future constitutional movements and introduced ideas that would shape the political landscape of the late Ottoman period and beyond. The notion of citizenship, legal equality, and secular governance would be taken up by successive generations of reformers, culminating in the eventual rise of the Turkish Republic. In many ways, the Tanzimat can be seen as the first major experiment in state-led modernization in the Islamic world, an ambitious attempt to reconcile tradition with the demands of modernity. Though incomplete and contested, it marked a turning point in Ottoman history, a moment when the empire looked westward in search of renewal and survival. Mehmed II, the Conqueror, and the fall of Constantinople. Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, is one of the most significant figures in the history of the Ottoman Empire. His reign marked the culmination of centuries of Ottoman expansion, and his conquest of Constantinople in 1453 changed the course of history. The fall of Constantinople, a city that had withstood numerous sieges over the centuries, symbolized the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of a new era. Mehmed's vision, military genius, and determination were instrumental in bringing about this dramatic shift in the balance of power in Europe and Asia. Born in 1432 to Sultan Murad II, Mehmed was destined for greatness from an early age. He was a capable and ambitious ruler who showed a keen interest in both military and intellectual matters. His education included training in the arts of war, as well as learning about literature, philosophy, and Islamic law. These diverse influences shaped his approach to leadership and governance. As a young prince, Mehmed had witnessed the complexities of Ottoman politics and was determined to solidify the empire's power and reputation. When he ascended to the throne in 1444 at the age of 12, Mehmed's reign was initially interrupted by the intervention of his father, Sultan Murad, who returned to power briefly to quell rebellions within the empire. However, it was during his second reign, starting in 1451, that Mehmed's ambition began to take form in his decision to launch the siege of Constantinople. The city, once the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, had long been a symbol of Christian Europe's dominance and a strategic point between East and West. Despite the decline of the Byzantine Empire, the city's fortifications remained formidable, and its defenders were determined to hold their ground. Mehmed's decision to lay siege to Constantinople was influenced by both political and religious motivations. The city held immense strategic value, serving as the gateway between Europe and Asia, and controlling it would provide the Ottomans with unmatched power in the region. Moreover, Mehmed saw the conquest of Constantinople as a religious duty. As a devout Muslim, he viewed the fall of the city as a way to fulfill a prophecy, to conquer the last bastion of the Christian Byzantine Empire, and to assert the dominance of Islam in the Mediterranean. This religious zeal, coupled with his strategic vision, led Mehmed to prepare for a siege that would be unlike any other in history. In preparation for the assault, Mehmed gathered an army of around 80,000 soldiers, including elite janissaries, skilled archers, and siege engineers. The Ottomans had become experts in siege warfare, and Mehmed was determined to use the latest technology to breach the walls of Constantinople. One of the most innovative aspects of the siege was the use of massive cannons, which had never before been employed on such a scale. These enormous weapons were designed by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had been recruited by Mehmed after being promised a large reward. The cannons were capable of hurling huge stones capable of damaging the thick walls of Constantinople, and their constant bombardment played a crucial role in weakening the city's defenses. On April 2, 1453, Mehmed's forces began their siege of Constantinople, surrounding the city on land and sea. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos, had only around 7,000 defenders, vastly outnumbered by the Ottoman forces. The defenders were determined to hold out, however, and were reinforced by volunteers from various parts of Europe, including Genoese soldiers led by the famed Admiral Giovanni Giustiniani. Despite these reinforcements, the Byzantines were greatly outmatched by the Ottomans' superior numbers and resources. Mehmed's army began with a relentless bombardment of the city's walls, which had been built to withstand sieges for centuries. However, the Byzantine defenses held firm for some time. The Ottomans also used a tactic that would prove to be essential, a naval blockade. The Ottoman fleet surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and preventing reinforcements from reaching Constantinople. This blockade effectively isolated the city and began to wear down the defenders' morale. The Ottomans also employed psychological tactics, such as spreading rumors of imminent reinforcements from other Christian powers, in hopes of sowing confusion and uncertainty within the city. Despite the overwhelming odds, the defenders of Constantinople did not surrender easily. The Byzantine soldiers fought bravely, and the city's fortifications, though damaged by the Ottoman artillery, remained formidable. The walls, which had withstood centuries of attacks, were a testament to the strategic genius of the Byzantine engineers who had designed them. The defenders also had the advantage of fighting on home turf, knowing the city and its terrain intimately. However, Mehmed's siege tactics gradually wore down the city's defenses, and the situation for the defenders became increasingly dire. The turning point in the siege came on May 22, 1453, when the Ottomans launched a final, all-out assault on the city. Mehmed had ordered a massive coordinated attack from both land and sea. The siege cannons continued their bombardment, while the Ottomans used smaller but more maneuverable forces to breach sections of the walls. The Ottomans also made use of underground tunnels, attempting to undermine the walls and weaken their foundation. The defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, could not hold back the tide any longer. The final assault on May 29, 1453, broke the city's defenses. The Ottomans poured into Constantinople, overwhelming the defenders and capturing the city. Emperor Constantine V, realizing the battle was lost, fought valiantly to the end, but was ultimately killed in the fighting. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for over 1,000 years, and was a devastating blow to Christendom. For Mehmed II, the conquest was a momentous achievement, fulfilling his ambition to create a powerful, united Ottoman Empire and to establish himself as a ruler of great renown. Following the capture of Constantinople, Mehmed quickly set about transforming the city into the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Hagia Sophia, a magnificent church and symbol of Byzantine Christianity, was converted into a mosque, marking the triumph of Islam over Christianity in the region. The city was renamed Istanbul, and Mehmed implemented a series of reforms to make it the center of commerce, culture, and religion in the Ottoman Empire. The conquest also had profound geopolitical consequences, as it shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean, effectively ending the Byzantine Empire and signaling the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant power in the region. Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople was not just a military victory, but also a cultural and symbolic one. The city, which had once been the heart of the Christian world, became a symbol of Ottoman power and Islamic dominance. Mehmed's actions laid the groundwork for the Ottoman Empire to become one of the most powerful empires in world history, spanning 3 continents and lasting for over 400 years. His reign, marked by military conquest, religious zeal, and visionary leadership, left an indelible mark on history. In conclusion, Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was a pivotal moment in world history. It marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and the beginning of a new era in the Mediterranean and beyond. Mehmed's strategic brilliance, military prowess, and relentless determination made him one of history's greatest conquerors. The fall of Constantinople was not only a triumph for Mehmed, but it also reshaped the course of history, influencing the balance of power in Europe and the Middle East for centuries to come. The end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of modern Turkey. The Ottoman Empire, once a mighty and sprawling empire that spanned over 6 centuries, was nearing its end in the early 20th century. Its power, which had once extended across 3 continents, began to erode as it faced numerous internal and external challenges. The empire's demise was a complex and multifaceted process involving military defeats, nationalist movements, and the changing tides of geopolitics. This transformation eventually gave rise to the Republic of Turkey, a modern nation-state that would leave behind the remnants of the Ottoman legacy while forging a new identity for the Turkish people. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. Its once great military power had declined, and it struggled to maintain control over its diverse territories. The empire's multi-ethnic composition, which had been a source of strength in the past, now became a liability as nationalist movements emerged within its various provinces. These movements were fueled by the ideas of independence and self-determination that had swept across Europe in the 19th century, particularly after the French Revolution. The empire's once dominant position was weakened further by the rise of European powers such as Britain, France, and Russia, who sought to expand their influence in the region. The Balkan Wars, which took place between 1912 and 1913, marked a critical turning point in the empire's fortunes. These wars saw the loss of much of the Ottoman Empire's European territories to newly formed Balkan states. The empire's territorial losses were compounded by the fact that its military was no longer able to defend its vast borders. By the time World War I began, the Ottoman Empire had already been weakened by internal dissent, external pressures, and territorial losses. The empire was forced to align itself with the Central Powers, including Germany and Austria-Hungary, in the hope that victory in the war would allow it to regain some of its lost power and influence. World War I proved to be the final nail in the coffin for the Ottoman Empire. The empire's involvement in the war led to disastrous consequences. The Ottoman military was ill-prepared and poorly equipped to fight a modern war. The empire's vast size and diverse population made it difficult to coordinate efforts and maintain unity in the face of military defeat. The empire's leadership was also deeply divided, with some factions supporting the war while others advocated for peace. The internal strife further undermined the empire's ability to respond to external threats. As the war raged on, the Ottoman Empire's military suffered devastating defeats. The empire lost key battles in the Middle East and the Caucasus, and its once great army was slowly but steadily crushed by the Allied forces. The empire's capital, Istanbul, was under constant threat, and the Sultan's authority was increasingly called into question. By the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was on the brink of collapse. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, marked the beginning of the end for the empire. The treaty sought to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, carving up its territories and creating new nation-states in its place. In response to the treaty and the disintegration of the empire, a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk emerged in Anatolia. Ataturk, a military officer and visionary leader, rejected the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres and called for the creation of a new, independent Turkish state. He rallied support from various factions within the Turkish population, including military officers, intellectuals, and civilians, who shared a desire to break free from foreign influence and establish a modern, secular, and nationalistic Turkey. The Turkish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1922, was a defining moment in the creation of modern Turkey. Ataturk's forces, known as the Turkish National Movement, successfully repelled foreign occupying forces, including Greek, Armenian, and French troops, who had been granted control over parts of Anatolia. Ataturk's leadership and strategic brilliance were instrumental in securing victory for the nationalist forces. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state and established its modern borders. With the victory in the War of Independence, Ataturk set about transforming Turkey into a modern, secular republic. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed, with Ataturk as its first president. Ataturk's vision for the new nation was grounded in a deep commitment to modernization, secularism, and nationalism. He sought to break away from the Ottoman past and create a new identity for the Turkish people. The Sultanate was abolished, and the Caliphate, which had been a symbol of the Ottoman Empire's religious authority, was dismantled. Ataturk's reforms touched every aspect of Turkish life, from education and law to language and culture. One of Ataturk's most significant reforms was the establishment of a secular legal system. The Ottoman Empire had been governed by Islamic law, but Ataturk believed that a modern state required a secular approach to governance. He introduced a new civil code based on European models, which replaced Islamic law and granted greater rights and freedoms to women. Ataturk also implemented reforms in education, with an emphasis on science, technology, and modern languages. He sought to modernize Turkey's economy, promoting industrialization and agricultural reforms that would lay the foundation for a more self-sufficient nation. Ataturk's reforms were not limited to legal and economic changes. He also sought to reshape Turkish culture and identity. The adoption of the Latin alphabet in place of the Arabic script was one of the most symbolic reforms of Ataturk's era. This change was intended to modernize the Turkish language and make it more accessible to the masses. Ataturk also promoted a sense of national pride, encouraging the Turkish people to embrace their new identity as citizens of the Republic of Turkey rather than subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Nationalism became a central tenet of the new Turkish state, and Ataturk worked to create a sense of unity among the country's diverse ethnic and religious groups. Ataturk's leadership and vision helped transform Turkey from a crumbling empire into a modern nation-state. His reforms set the stage for a new era in Turkish history, characterized by rapid modernization and political stability. However, the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey was not without its challenges. The remnants of the Ottoman Empire's multi-ethnic and multi-religious structure posed significant challenges to Ataturk's vision of a homogeneous nation-state. The new republic had to contend with issues of ethnic identity, regionalism, and political instability, all of which were exacerbated by the legacy of the Ottoman past. Despite these challenges, Ataturk's vision for a secular, modern, and independent Turkey took root. The Republic of Turkey became a key player in regional and global politics, and Ataturk's legacy continued to shape the country's development for decades to come. His commitment to secularism and modernization laid the foundation for Turkey's transformation into a global power in the 21st century. In conclusion, the end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of modern Turkey were pivotal moments in world history. The Ottoman Empire's decline and eventual collapse marked the end of an era, but it also paved the way for the rise of a new, independent Turkish state. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's leadership and reforms were instrumental in shaping the modern Turkish identity, and his vision for a secular, modern, and nationalist state continues to influence Turkey today. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire may have faded, but its influence can still be seen in the cultural, political, and social fabric of the Republic of Turkey. The journey from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey was a complex and transformative process, but it ultimately led to the creation of a modern nation-state that would become a significant player on the global stage. As the Republic of Turkey continued to evolve in the years following its establishment, Ataturk's reforms remained central to the nation's identity. The years of the early Republic were a time of intense transformation. The new Turkish state, born from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, sought not only to modernize, but to solidify its position as an independent force in the world. Ataturk's determination to distance Turkey from its Ottoman past shaped many aspects of life in the country, including its foreign policy, military structure, and cultural expression. Ataturk's foreign policy was particularly marked by his desire to avoid entanglement in conflicts that had previously drawn the Ottoman Empire into costly wars. The Ottoman Empire had been involved in a web of alliances, conflicts, and territorial disputes across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The new Turkish Republic, under Ataturk's leadership, adopted a policy of neutrality, famously encapsulated in his maxim, "Peace at home, peace in the world." This doctrine sought to ensure that Turkey would focus on internal development and avoid unnecessary international conflict. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 had already secured Turkey's borders, and the Republic was keen to maintain these borders without engaging in further territorial disputes. During the 1920s and 1930s, Ataturk's government sought to secure its position internationally by building strong relations with European powers, while also maintaining an independent stance. His leadership also involved a significant military reform. The Ottoman military, although once one of the most formidable forces in the world, had deteriorated by the time of the empire's collapse. Ataturk, a former military officer, understood the importance of a modern, well-equipped military in securing the Republic's survival. Under his guidance, Turkey began to build a modern, disciplined military force that was both a symbol of national pride and a means of ensuring the security of the new republic. These efforts laid the foundation for the Turkish military's role as a key player in Turkish politics for much of the 20th century. Ataturk's secularism was also a defining characteristic of the new Turkish Republic. The Ottoman Empire had been an Islamic state, where religion played a central role in governance, law, and society. Ataturk, however, firmly believed that a modern nation-state could not be built on the basis of religious authority. He believed that the separation of religion and state was necessary for progress and modernization. As part of his secular reforms, Ataturk abolished religious courts and removed Islamic law from the legal system. This was a radical shift. As the Ottoman legal system had been based on Islamic jurisprudence for centuries. In place of Islamic law, Ataturk introduced a secular legal code which was largely based on the Swiss civil code. This new legal system granted greater rights to women, including the right to vote and hold office, and paved the way for more gender equality in Turkish society. Ataturk's secularism extended to other areas of public life as well. The state took control over religious institutions, and religious schools were replaced by secular, state-run educational institutions. Ataturk also encouraged the adoption of modern, Western-style dress and sought to reduce the public prominence of religious symbols. One of the most visible aspects of this transformation was the adoption of the Latin alphabet in place of the Arabic script. The change was not only symbolic of Turkey's modernization, but also practical, as it made reading and writing more accessible to the broader population. Ataturk's reforms in education, culture, and religion were designed to shift Turkey's identity away from its Ottoman Islamic past and towards a new, secular, and modern future. The impact of Ataturk's reforms was most visible in the urban centers of Turkey, particularly in Istanbul and Ankara, the new capital. Ankara was chosen as the new capital not only for its strategic location, but also as a symbol of the new, modern Turkey. Ataturk's decision to move the capital from Istanbul to Ankara represented a break with the Ottoman past and a move towards a more progressive nationalist identity. Under Ataturk's leadership, Ankara transformed into a city of modern architecture, reflecting the broader goals of modernization. New institutions, roads, and buildings were constructed, and the city began to take on the appearance of a European-style capital. However, despite Ataturk's far-reaching reforms, the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey was not without its challenges. One of the most significant issues was the integration of the diverse ethnic and religious groups that had once made up the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been home to a wide range of ethnicities, including Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, and others. The creation of the Turkish Republic, which emphasized Turkish nationalism, led to tensions between different groups. The Kurdish issue, in particular, remains a significant challenge for Turkey to this day. Ataturk's government sought to suppress ethnic differences and promote a singular Turkish identity, a policy that led to repression and discrimination against non-Turkish minorities, particularly the Kurds. In the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's fall, Turkey also had to contend with the economic challenges that came with establishing a new state. The empire's economy had been in decline for centuries, and the new republic faced the monumental task of rebuilding a modern, industrialized economy. Ataturk's government pursued a policy of state-led industrialization, with a focus on building infrastructure, developing heavy industry, and improving agriculture. These efforts were supported by the construction of new roads, bridges, and factories, and the establishment of state-owned enterprises. Despite these efforts, the economy remained largely agrarian and dependent on agriculture, and Turkey continued to face significant economic difficulties throughout the 20th century. Ataturk's reforms were not without controversy, and his authoritarian approach to governance was one of the points of contention. While he is hailed as a visionary leader who transformed Turkey into a modern republic, his leadership was also marked by a centralized and top-down style of governance. Ataturk's political party, the Republican People's Party, CHP, was the dominant political force in Turkey, and opposition parties were often suppressed. Political dissent was not tolerated, and Ataturk's leadership was characterized by strict control over the media and public discourse. Despite the emphasis on secularism and modernization, Ataturk's regime did not permit the kind of political pluralism that would later emerge in democratic Turkey. In the years following Ataturk's death in 1938, his reforms continued to shape Turkey's political and social landscape. His successor, İsmet İnönü, carried on Ataturk's policies, though with a more moderate approach. However, the legacy of Ataturk's vision for Turkey persisted, and his reforms laid the foundation for Turkey's modernization throughout the 20th century. Today, Ataturk remains a revered figure in Turkey, and his ideas continue to influence Turkish politics and culture. His vision of a secular, modern, and nationalist state is enshrined in the Turkish constitution, and his principles of Kemalism, nationalism, secularism, republicanism, and statism continue to shape the identity of the Turkish Republic. In conclusion, the end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of modern Turkey was a transformative period in world history. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a result of internal decay, external pressures, and nationalist movements. The emergence of the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk marked the beginning of a new era, characterized by secularism, modernization, and nationalism. Ataturk's reforms, while not without controversy, laid the foundation for the modern Turkish state and continued to shape Turkey's political, cultural, and social identity. The Republic of Turkey, born from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, remains one of the most dynamic and influential countries in the Middle East, with a rich history and a complex relationship with its past. Osman of the birth of an empire. In the mists of the 13th century, as the crumbling remnants of the once mighty Seljuk Sultanate of Rum scattered across Anatolia, a new and unassuming power began to stir. It was not a kingdom born of opulence or overwhelming military might, but one forged in the crucible of chaos. A small principality led by a man named Osman, the son of Ertuğrul. From his humble beginnings, Osman would go on to plant the seed of an empire that would stretch across 3 continents and endure for over 6 centuries. His story, though shrouded in legend and embellished over time, remains a pivotal chapter in the history of the Islamic world and beyond. Osman's journey began in the borderlands of Anatolia, where the collapse of central authority had left a vacuum of power. These border regions, known as the Uç, were constantly threatened by Byzantine forces to the west and other Turkish tribes vying for control in the east. Here, survival depended on both martial strength and political acumen. Osman, raised among warriors and tribal elders, was quick to demonstrate his potential as a leader. He inherited his father's small dominion near the town of Suat, and in time proved himself a skilled tactician and a charismatic figure capable of uniting various tribal factions under his banner. While many of the details of Osman's life are difficult to verify with absolute certainty, due to the blending of historical fact with oral tradition, the themes remain consistent. He was a man of vision, resilience, and deep conviction. According to popular legend, Osman had a prophetic dream in which a great tree sprang from his chest, growing to cover the world in its branches. This dream, interpreted as a divine sign, would be seen as foretelling the birth of a great empire. Whether literal or symbolic, it marked the beginning of Osman's transformation from tribal chieftain to imperial founder. What set Osman apart was his ability to capitalize on the geopolitical instability of the time. The Byzantine Empire, once a colossus straddling Europe and Asia, was weakened by internal strife and external pressure. Osman's small but determined force launched raids into Byzantine territory, often striking swiftly and retreating before facing organized resistance. These incursions were not mere acts of opportunism. They were calculated maneuvers aimed at expanding his territory and increasing his prestige. Over time, Osman captured several important fortresses, including Yenişehir, which would later serve as a springboard for further conquests. Osman's rise was also facilitated by his adept use of religion as a unifying force. Presenting himself as a Gazi, a warrior for Islam, he attracted numerous followers who were eager to fight for both faith and fortune. These Ghazis formed the backbone of his military campaigns and helped him carve out a realm that, though small in its early years, possessed the seeds of imperial ambition. The idea of holy war against the infidels was deeply ingrained in the psyche of the Anatolian frontier, and Osman's principality became a magnet for those who believed they were part of a divine mission. Moreover, Osman understood the importance of governance and social order. As his territory expanded, he established rudimentary institutions to manage affairs of state, ensuring loyalty among his subjects and fostering a sense of unity. He issued land grants to loyal warriors, formed alliances through marriage and diplomacy, and began laying the foundations of what would later become an elaborate and sophisticated administrative system under his successors. He was not merely a warrior, he was a statesman, planting the roots of enduring governance. Though the empire that bears his name would not reach its full glory until centuries later, the foundational ethos was born during Osman's time. He embodied the virtues of discipline, courage, and justice, qualities that were celebrated and mythologized in later Ottoman literature. He maintained strong ties with his people, often consulting tribal elders and emphasizing consensus in decision-making. This blend of traditional tribal leadership with emerging statecraft would become a hallmark of Ottoman governance. One of the pivotal moments in Osman's life came with the capture of the fortress of Karacahisar. This strategic victory not only gave him control over a significant settlement, but also allowed him to establish the first Islamic court in the region, cementing his role as both a temporal and spiritual leader. From that point forward, the legitimacy of his rule was reinforced not just by conquest, but by law and religion. He appointed qadis, Islamic judges, supported religious scholars, and ensured that Islamic principles guided the governance of his territories. Despite his achievements, Osman's reign was not without challenges. Rival Turkish beyliks, principalities, posed a constant threat, as did the occasional resurgence of Byzantine resistance. Yet Osman remained resolute. He cultivated loyalty not only through military success, but through fairness and generosity. His followers were not bound by fear, but by mutual respect and shared vision. Under his leadership, what was once a fragile frontier community evolved into a coherent and ambitious state structure. As he aged, Osman began to hand over more authority to his son Orhan, who would eventually take up the mantle and carry the Ottoman legacy forward. Osman died around the year 1324, though some sources suggest it may have been slightly earlier. At the time of his death, the principality he left behind was still modest in size but rich in potential. His dream, whether born of sleep or ambition, was now in motion. Orhan would go on to formalize many of the structures his father had initiated. Under his rule, the Ottomans would capture Bursa, marking a significant shift from a tribal polity to an emerging empire with a permanent capital. But none of this would have been possible without the groundwork laid by Osman. His legacy was not merely territorial, it was ideological, institutional, and spiritual. The empire that would one day challenge Europe, dominate the Middle East, and influence global politics for centuries was rooted in the values and vision of a man who began his journey on the dusty frontiers of Anatolia. Osman first is remembered today not only as a conqueror, but as a founder. His name became synonymous with the empire, the Ottomans deriving directly from Osmanlı, the House of Osman. The reverence accorded to him by future generations of sultans served as a reminder of the humble origins of their vast dominion. His life demonstrated how determination, unity, and a clear sense of purpose could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. In a world where empires often rose and fell with dizzying speed, the endurance of the Ottoman Empire stands as a testament to the strength of its foundations. Osman's ability to inspire loyalty, adapt to changing circumstances, and lay the groundwork for effective governance ensured that his creation would not be fleeting. The torch he lit in Sot would burn for centuries, illuminating the path for countless rulers, scholars, and warriors who followed in his footsteps. As history has shown time and again, the mightiest empires often begin with the vision of a single individual. In the case of the Ottomans, that individual was Osman I, a man whose dream of a tree covering the world would become a profound metaphor for the rise of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. His life remains an enduring symbol of resilience, leadership, and the boundless potential of those who dare to dream beyond the horizon. The era of Sultanate of women. The era of the Sultanate of women was one of the most extraordinary and often misunderstood periods in Ottoman history. Spanning the 16th and 17th centuries, this era was defined not by a sultan's sword or a grand vizier's strategy, but by the power and influence wielded by women in the imperial court, specifically the mothers and wives of reigning sultans. In a world often dominated by male authority, the Ottoman Empire experienced a remarkable deviation from tradition. Women of the imperial harem rose not only to prominence, but to political dominance, shaping policy, orchestrating alliances, and even influencing succession. At the heart of this story lies the evolving structure of power in the Ottoman court, where the private realm of the harem transformed into a key center of decision-making and intrigue. It began with Hurrem Sultan, also known in the West as Roxolana, the beloved consort and later legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Her rise was unprecedented. Traditionally, sultans did not marry their concubines, and women of the harem were expected to fade into the background once their sons came of age. But Hurrem broke all conventions. Not only did she remain a constant presence at court, but she also wielded considerable influence over state matters. Her marriage to Suleiman scandalized the court and signaled the beginning of a shift. She was deeply involved in diplomatic correspondence, charitable works, and palace politics. Her intelligence and political acumen helped lay the foundation for the powerful roles that women would play in the decades to come. Following Hurrem, her daughter Mihrimah Sultan also emerged as a political actor, often coordinating with her mother to maintain influence over Suleiman and later protect the interests of her brother, Selim II. When Selim ascended the throne, the real shift began. As sultans became less engaged in active governance and military campaigns, the vacuum left behind allowed palace women, especially the Valid Sultan or Queen Mother, to step into roles of unprecedented authority. These women were no longer confined to the domestic realm. They became diplomats, regents, patrons of the arts and architecture, and cunning strategists maneuvering through the dangerous waters of palace intrigue. Perhaps no figure exemplifies this era more than Kösem Sultan, one of the most powerful and enduring figures in Ottoman history. Originally a slave of Greek origin, she rose to become the favorite consort of Sultan Ahmed I and later the Valid Sultan for multiple sultans, including her sons Murad IV and Ibrahim I, and even her grandson Mehmed IV. Kosem essentially ruled the empire through regency during the minority of her sons, and she wielded direct political authority from behind the veil of the harem. Her influence extended into every aspect of court life, from the appointment of viziers to the orchestration of foreign policy. Kosem's power was so great that it ultimately made her enemies, and she was assassinated in a palace coup, ironically orchestrated by another powerful woman who would dominate the empire after her, Turhan Hatice Sultan. Turhan was a formidable rival and eventually succeeded Kosem as Valid Sultan when her son, Mehmed IV, took the throne. Her rule marked the end of the Sultanate of women, but it was no less influential. She was a visionary patron of architecture and social welfare, sponsoring the construction of the Yeni Mosque in Istanbul, among other projects. Her political skill helped bring a sense of order to the empire during a period of instability, and she continued the legacy of female political power that had become normalized over the previous century. These women operated in a court environment that was deeply hierarchical, secretive, and dangerous. The imperial harem was not merely a place of leisure and beauty. It was a highly organized institution where politics, power, and survival were in constant play. Alliances were forged, rivalries bred suspicion, and the lives of princes could depend entirely on the favor or wrath of the women within these walls. The Valid Sultan, in particular, held a unique role as both maternal figure and political force. Her position allowed her to oversee the inner workings of the harem while also interacting with the outer political world through the sultan and key officials. She had access to state finances, influence over appointments, and the authority to issue orders that could shape the empire's trajectory. One of the more fascinating aspects of the Sultanate of Women was its lasting cultural impact. These women were not only political players, but also significant patrons of architecture, education, and religious institutions. The mosques, schools, fountains, and charitable complexes they commissioned still stand today as testaments to their legacy. Harem Sultan's complex in Istanbul, known as the Haseki Sultan Complex, combined a mosque, hospital, and school, revealing a vision not just for spiritual guidance, but for social responsibility. Kosem and Turhan similarly invested heavily in public works, extending their influence far beyond the palace walls. Despite their power, the women of this era were constantly under threat. The Ottoman court was rife with suspicion, plots, and betrayals. Political rivals, both male and female, viewed the influence of the Valid Sultan as a threat to traditional governance. Yet, time and again, these women demonstrated remarkable resilience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. They navigated coups, wars, and internal dissent with a deftness that rivaled any male statesman. In many cases, their actions preserved the stability of the empire during times when sultans were either too young, too unstable, or too disengaged to govern effectively. The Sultanate of Women also challenges modern assumptions about gender roles in Islamic empires. While it's true that women in the Ottoman Empire were generally expected to remain in the private sphere, this era reveals that power could and did exist within those boundaries. The harem became a center of influence, not in spite of its seclusion, but because of it. The invisibility of these women to the outside world allowed them a unique kind of freedom to maneuver politically. Their seclusion did not mean silence. Their veils did not mean weakness. Behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, the empire was being shaped as much by these women as by the men who sat on the throne. Over time, the growing centralization of the empire and the professionalization of its bureaucracy led to a decline in the direct influence of the harem women. The era of the Sultanate of Women came to a gradual end in the late 17th century, and subsequent generations of sultans sought to reassert traditional patriarchal norms. Yet the legacy of this era remained. It had demonstrated that leadership, wisdom, and political talent were not limited by gender. The empire had thrived, at times survived, because of these women's actions, and their names were etched into the fabric of Ottoman history. In the end, the Sultanate of Women was a product of both circumstance and individual brilliance. It was born from the vacuum left by disengaged sultans, sustained by the structural evolution of the palace system and defined by the extraordinary abilities of women who refused to be confined by the roles assigned to them. They were mothers and protectors, but also strategists and stateswomen. Their legacy serves as a compelling reminder that power does not always wear a crown or carry a sword. Sometimes it wears a veil, moves through whispers, and changes the course of empires from behind closed doors. The lasting impact of the Sultanate of Women extended beyond the political realm and into the psychological landscape of the Ottoman court and society at large. These influential women redefined what power looked like in a deeply patriarchal structure. By operating from within the harem, a space traditionally seen as domestic and private, they blurred the lines between public authority and private influence. Their ability to affect foreign policy, shape internal governance, and influence succession decisions left an indelible imprint not only on the empire, but on the very idea of female leadership within Islamic civilization. The role of these women also had generational consequences. They raised future sultans, instilling in them political values, religious education, and often a sense of statecraft, far more intimately than male courtiers or tutors ever could. The upbringing of these rulers within the harem meant that their mothers were often their primary advisors during their formative years. This created strong mother-son bonds that translated into trust and influence once these sons ascended the throne. In many ways, the Valid Sultan was both the architect of the next reign and its guardian. Moreover, the architectural legacy of these women transformed the Ottoman urban landscape. The mosques and charitable foundations they commissioned became integral to the spiritual and social fabric of Ottoman cities. Their architectural patronage was not merely decorative or ceremonial, it was functional, enduring, and deeply embedded in Ottoman civic life. Through these works, they secured a kind of immortality, ensuring their names and influence would persist long after their time in the palace had passed. Ultimately, the Sultanate of Women was not a deviation from Ottoman tradition, but rather an evolution of it. It revealed the elasticity of power within the empire, and how, under the right conditions, influence could emerge from unexpected quarters. Their reign, though cloaked in shadows and subtlety, stands as one of the most fascinating chapters in Ottoman history, a period when the veiled voices of women spoke louder than ever before. Nationalism and internal fragmentation. Nationalism and internal fragmentation form a complex and often paradoxical relationship in the history of nations. On the surface, nationalism seeks unity, a collective identity forged by shared culture, language, and values. It is a powerful force that binds people together under a common cause or heritage. But beneath this unifying drive, nationalism also holds the potential to fracture states from within, particularly in multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, or regionally diverse societies. This dual nature has shaped countless historical narratives, both uplifting and devastating. The same energy that inspires independence and solidarity can, when turned inward, expose the deep fissures that exist beneath the national surface. In its most constructive form, nationalism fosters a sense of belonging. People who share common myths, traditions, and a vision for the future come together, often in resistance to foreign rule or oppression. Nationalism, in this sense, has played a pivotal role in the formation of modern nation-states. The unification of Germany and Italy in the 19th century, the anti-colonial struggles across Asia and Africa in the 20th century, and the formation of new nations after the fall of empires all testify to the unifying potential of nationalism. It can invigorate the masses, legitimize political authority, and serve as a rallying cry for progress. Leaders tap into nationalist sentiment to galvanize public support, and populations respond with loyalty, sacrifice, and collective identity. However, this same force becomes volatile when national identity is contested within the borders of a single state. Internal fragmentation occurs when different groups, be they ethnic, religious, linguistic, or regional, feel alienated from the dominant national narrative. Nationalism that elevates one group's identity to the exclusion or suppression of others breeds resentment, marginalization, and conflict. In such cases, nationalism transforms from a unifying ideal into a divisive force, leading not to solidarity but to fragmentation, secession, and at times civil war. Throughout history, the destructive potential of internal fragmentation has repeatedly been unleashed when the nationalism of one group collides with the aspirations of others. The breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s remains one of the most harrowing modern examples. Under the surface of Tito's unifying leadership, nationalistic tensions among Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and others simmered for decades. When central authority weakened, these tensions erupted violently, fueled by nationalist rhetoric, ethnic grievances, and competing historical narratives. The result was one of the bloodiest conflicts in post-World War II Europe, where nationalism no longer served as a binding agent but as a justification for exclusion and ethnic cleansing. Similarly, in the post-colonial world, nationalism often failed to accommodate the complex ethnic mosaics inherited from arbitrary colonial borders. Many African and Asian states, upon gaining independence, struggled to forge a cohesive national identity among disparate groups. Nigeria, for instance, has long grappled with internal fragmentation, with the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo ethnic groups each asserting distinct political and cultural claims. The Biafran War of the late 1960s was a tragic manifestation of this tension, as Igbo nationalists declared independence from Nigeria, triggering a brutal civil conflict. The war left a legacy of distrust, repression, and unresolved ethnic divisions that continue to shape Nigerian politics to this day. In other cases, internal fragmentation arises not only from ethnic difference, but from regional, linguistic, and even ideological divides. Spain offers an instructive case in the enduring Catalan independence movement. Catalonia, with its own language and historical identity, has long felt culturally and economically distinct from the rest of Spain. While Spain functions as a democracy with autonomous regions, Catalan nationalists argue that the Spanish state systematically undermines their autonomy and identity. The 2017 independence referendum, deemed illegal by Madrid, exposed deep rifts in Spanish society. What one side saw as a legitimate expression of self-determination, the other saw as an existential threat to national unity. This standoff continues to challenge the idea that a single nation-state can represent multiple, often competing, national identities. The challenge of internal fragmentation is further exacerbated in democracies, where majority rule can sometimes become a tool of exclusion. When nationalism becomes synonymous with the identity of the majority group, minority voices are drowned out, their grievances dismissed, and their loyalty questioned. In such environments, political systems risk becoming majoritarian rather than inclusive. India, the world's largest democracy, has seen an intensification of Hindu nationalism in recent years, raising fears among religious and ethnic minorities about their place in the national fabric. Critics argue that when national identity is narrowly defined by religion or culture, it undermines the pluralistic foundations of democracy and sows the seeds of fragmentation. Even long-standing democracies are not immune. The United States, often seen as a melting pot of cultures, has witnessed growing internal polarization along political, racial, and ideological lines. While not rooted in traditional ethnic nationalism, the rise of hyper-partisan identities, each claiming to represent the true spirit of the nation, has led to a fractured political landscape. The Capitol riots of January 6, 2021, serve as a stark reminder of how deeply divided conceptions of national identity can spill into violence. In such a context, nationalism is no longer a unifying force, but a battlefield of competing loyalties and narratives. The digital age, too, has transformed the nature of nationalism and internal fragmentation. Social media has amplified echo chambers and fostered identity-based communities that transcend national borders while simultaneously deepening internal divides. Algorithms reward outrage and tribalism, making it easier for nationalist movements to gain traction by appealing to fear and resentment. Online spaces become arenas for constructing competing versions of reality, often disconnected from the shared experiences that once sustained national cohesion. The result is a society where multiple nations may exist within the same geographic boundaries, divided not just by ethnicity or region, but by belief systems, values, and perceived truths. Addressing the tension between nationalism and internal fragmentation requires a careful balancing act. States must promote inclusive nationalism, one that celebrates diversity as part of the national identity rather than a threat to it. This involves building institutions that reflect the country's demographic complexity and fostering narratives that accommodate multiple identities within a shared national framework. Federalism, decentralization, and power sharing arrangements have proven effective in some cases, allowing groups to express their identities without challenging the legitimacy of the broader state. Education, too, plays a vital role in shaping how national identity is understood and internalized. Curricula that present a pluralistic view of history, highlight contributions from all communities, and emphasize democratic values can nurture a sense of shared purpose. Media, civil society, and political leadership all bear responsibility in resisting exclusionary nationalism and promoting dialogue across divides. In essence, the future of national cohesion depends on the ability to reconcile the desire for unity with the reality of diversity. Ultimately, nationalism and internal fragmentation are not inherently incompatible. The challenge lies in how nationalism is framed and operationalized. If it becomes a vehicle for exclusion, it will inevitably lead to fragmentation and conflict. But if it is harnessed to build bridges, affirm shared values, and embrace pluralism, it can be a powerful force for cohesion and resilience. The stakes are high, for the success or failure of this balancing act will shape not only the fate of individual nations, but the future of global stability in an increasingly interconnected world. Bayezid II and the Age of Diplomacy. When Bayezid II ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1481, the empire stood at a critical crossroads. It had expanded considerably under his father, Mehmed the Conqueror, and now faced the challenge of consolidating that growth while navigating a changing world. Bayezid inherited not only a vast and diverse empire, but also a complex web of political, religious, and military tensions both within and beyond his borders. Unlike his father, whose reign was marked by aggressive military campaigns and monumental conquests like the fall of Constantinople, Bayezid's leadership would come to be defined by a different strategy, one centered on diplomacy, internal stability, and cautious governance. His era marked a unique phase in Ottoman history, often referred to as the Age of Diplomacy, where negotiation and subtlety often took precedence over outright warfare. From the outset, Bayezid II faced significant challenges to his rule. Even his accession to the throne was contested. His brother Shem Sultan, with the backing of some powerful factions within the empire and external European forces, posed a direct challenge to his authority. The resulting conflict could have easily plunged the empire into civil war, but Bayezid approached the situation with strategic restraint. Rather than recklessly escalating the fight, he combined military preparedness with a shrewd use of diplomacy. When Shem sought refuge with the Knights of Rhodes and later fell into the hands of the papacy, Bayezid negotiated with European powers to ensure his brother remained in custody. This move not only neutralized a threat to his rule, but also served as an early example of Bayezid's ability to use diplomacy to resolve internal disputes without destabilizing the broader empire. Bayezid's reign was marked by a commitment to internal consolidation. Recognizing the diverse ethnic and religious makeup of his empire, he adopted policies aimed at promoting harmony and tolerance. Perhaps the most notable example of this was his response to the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. When the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra decree that forced Jews to convert or leave, Bayezid opened the doors of the Ottoman Empire to these refugees. He sent ships to facilitate their migration and ensured they were welcomed into Ottoman society. This decision was not only a moral stance, but also a strategic one. The influx of Sephardic Jews brought valuable skills in medicine, finance, and craftsmanship, strengthening the empire's economy and administrative capacity. Bayezid reportedly mocked the Spanish rulers, saying they had impoverished their country while enriching his own. His gesture symbolized the Ottoman Empire's emerging role as a haven of relative tolerance during an era of widespread persecution in Europe. While Bayezid's foreign policy was notably less expansionist than his predecessors, it was far from passive. He carefully managed relations with European powers, the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Safavid dynasty in Persia. Rather than engaging in constant warfare, Bayezid often chose the path of negotiation and alliance building. His aim was to secure the empire's borders and strengthen its position in a rapidly shifting geopolitical environment. The Venetian Republic, a longtime rival of the Ottomans, was a focal point of his diplomacy. While tensions over trade and influence in the Mediterranean persisted, Bayezid negotiated treaties that allowed for sustained commercial interaction. These agreements ensured the flow of goods, wealth, and knowledge between East and West, reinforcing the Ottomans' central role in regional economics. Bayezid also took a calculated approach to managing the eastern frontier, especially with the rise of the Safavid Empire under Shah Ismail. The Safavids posed a unique ideological threat to the Sunni Ottoman state due to their promotion of Twelver Shi'ism, which sharply contrasted with the Sunni orthodoxy upheld by the Ottomans. Bayezid was aware of the destabilizing potential of this movement, particularly as it gained popularity among the Anatolian Turkmen population. While he avoided an all-out war during his reign, he did implement internal measures to monitor and limit Safavid influence. These included surveillance of Shia communities and diplomatic efforts to curb the spread of subversive religious ideologies. Once again, his focus was on maintaining the delicate balance of power and preventing ideological divisions from turning into open conflict. Within the empire, Bayezid invested heavily in administrative reform and cultural development. He aimed to strengthen the structures of governance, reduce corruption, and ensure justice across his vast territories. His reign saw a revival of Islamic scholarship, architecture, and the arts, building on the foundations laid by his father. Bayezid himself was a patron of the sciences and a poet, known by the pen name Adli. His interest in culture and literature reflected a broader vision of leadership that valued intellect and civility alongside military might. Under his patronage, Istanbul continued to flourish as a center of learning and cosmopolitan life. Educational institutions, mosques, and public works were commissioned across the empire, further binding together its diverse populations. Bayezid's diplomatic acumen was perhaps most evident in his dealings with the Christian states of Europe. He skillfully played the political rivalries of European powers to the Ottomans' advantage. By maintaining peace with certain states and fostering trade, he avoided the formation of broad coalitions against his empire. He also provided naval assistance to Muslim allies in the Mediterranean, balancing acts of soft power with occasional military support to assert Ottoman interests without overextending resources. His strategy created breathing room for the empire to consolidate its power and focus on internal development. Nevertheless, Bayezid's reign was not without its difficulties. His cautious approach sometimes drew criticism for lacking the boldness of his predecessors. Some military elites, hungry for the spoils of conquest, were frustrated by the restrained foreign policy. Additionally, his later years were marred by declining health and increasing factionalism within the court. The issue of succession once again reared its head, with tensions rising between his sons, particularly between Selim and Ahmed. As the internal power struggle intensified, Bayezid was eventually forced to abdicate in favor of Selim I in 1512. The transition of power was not smooth and culminated in a brief period of violence, but it also marked a significant shift in Ottoman policy. Selim would go on to launch a far more aggressive military campaign, expanding the empire dramatically, but it was Bayezid's period of stabilization and consolidation that had prepared the foundation for this resurgence. Looking back, Bayezid II's reign might lack the spectacular military conquests or dramatic sieges that dominate popular narratives of Ottoman history, but it represents a critical phase of maturation for the empire. It was a time when diplomacy, tolerance, and calculated statecraft were elevated to central tools of governance. His leadership demonstrated that strength could be found not only on the battlefield, but also in the chambers of negotiation, in acts of compassion, and in the slow, deliberate work of building a durable state. The legacy of Bayezid II lies in his ability to maintain unity in a vast and diverse empire, to cultivate culture and knowledge, and to navigate the turbulent politics of the age with dignity and foresight. His reign remains a testament to the power of diplomacy in an age too often defined by war. Bayezid II's legacy endures not through tales of conquest, but through his cultivation of stability and statesmanship in a volatile age. His leadership offers a counterpoint to the often singular focus on military expansion in Ottoman historiography. He understood that the true strength of an empire did not lie solely in the size of its territories, but in its ability to manage diversity, foster economic growth, and project influence through alliances and trade. His reign set a precedent for the empire's ability to coexist and cooperate with its neighbors, even those of differing faiths and ideologies, as long as it served the strategic interests of the state. Economically, Bayezid invested in infrastructure that strengthened trade routes both on land and at sea. Caravanserais, bridges, and ports were improved and expanded, connecting the various parts of the empire and facilitating commerce. Istanbul, already a thriving metropolis under Mehmed II, blossomed further under Bayezid's rule, becoming not just a political capital but also a hub of economic and cultural activity that attracted merchants, scholars, and artists from across the known world. This period of relative peace allowed internal markets to flourish and gave rise to a growing middle class that would become crucial to the empire's long-term stability. Religiously, Bayezid maintained a careful balance between Sunni orthodoxy and the necessity of religious tolerance. While he took steps to limit the influence of radical or destabilizing sects, he also recognized the importance of accommodating the empire's many faith communities. Orthodox Christians, Jews, and other minority groups were allowed to live and practice their beliefs with considerable autonomy under the millet system, a pragmatic model that helped prevent internal unrest. This policy of tolerance, grounded not in modern ideals of pluralism, but in a practical approach to governance, ensured the cooperation and loyalty of these communities. Ultimately, Bayezid II's reign can be seen as a bridge between two powerful phases of the Ottoman Empire: the aggressive expansionism of his father Mehmed the Conqueror and the militant imperialism of his son Selim I. His leadership style, marked by reflection, moderation, and diplomacy, preserved the empire during a potentially fragile period and allowed it to grow stronger from within. Though history often favors warriors and empire builders, Bayezid stands as a reminder that the architects of peace and pragmatism play no less vital a role in shaping the fate of empires.